The early morning sun cut through the haze at Naval Air Station Oceana, painting the tarmac in shades of amber and shadow. Captain Sarah Mitchell stood at attention in Commander Marcus Webb's office, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on a point just above his shoulder. The room smelled of old coffee and disappointment, a scent she had become intimately familiar with over the past 6 months. "You're being reassigned," Webb said, not looking up from the tablet in his hands. His voice carried the casual cruelty of a man who had delivered bad news so many times it had become routine. The fluorescent light above flickered, casting shifting shadows across his desk cluttered with operational reports and performance reviews. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Reassigned. The word hung in the air like an accusation, like a judgment already passed. 6 months ago, she had been one of the most promising pilots in the squadron, her record spotless, her future bright as the afterburners on an FA-18. Then came the mission over the Persian Gulf, the one no one talked about anymore, the one that had left her with a traumatic brain injury that the Navy doctors insisted was mild and manageable. Words that felt like weapons disguised as reassurance. The mission had started like any other. Routine patrol, standard operating procedures, everything by the book. Sarah had been flying wingman for Lieutenant Commander Rick Paulson, a veteran pilot with 15 years of experience and a reputation for cool-headed decision-making under pressure. They had been providing air support for a special operations team conducting a raid on a suspected weapons cache in the mountains along the Afghan-Pakistan border. The intelligence had been solid, or so they thought. The target was supposed to be lightly defended, maybe a few sentries with small arms, nothing that would pose a serious threat to the ground team or their air support. But intelligence is only as good as the sources it comes from, and sometimes those sources are wrong. Sometimes they're catastrophically wrong. Sarah remembered every detail of that morning with crystalline clarity, the way the sun had just begun to peek over the eastern mountains, painting the rugged terrain in shades of orange and gold, the way her FA-18 had handled perfectly, responsive to every input, a marvel of engineering that felt like an extension of her own body. The way Paulson's voice had sounded over the radio, calm and professional, as he confirmed their position and the location of the ground team. "Where?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt building in her chest, despite the way the room seemed to tilt slightly at the edges of her vision. "Test pilot program. You'll be evaluating legacy aircraft for potential decommission." Webb finally looked up, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that might have been pity, or might have been contempt. It was hard to tell the difference anymore. His gaze lingered on her for a moment too long, assessing, measuring, finding her wanting. Consider it a lateral move. Lateral. The word was a lie, and they both knew it. This was a demotion disguised as an opportunity, a way to shuffle her out of active combat status without the paperwork of a medical discharge. Sarah had seen it happen to other pilots, the ones who came back different, who flinched at loud noises or struggled with the cognitive load of split-second decisions at Mach 2. She had promised herself she would never be one of them, but promises meant nothing when your brain had been rattled inside your skull like dice in a cup. The medical evaluation had been thorough, almost invasively so. They had put her through every test imaginable: MRIs, CT scans, neurological examinations, cognitive assessments, psychological evaluations. The results had been maddeningly vague. Yes, there was evidence of trauma. Yes, there were symptoms. But nothing that should permanently ground a pilot. Nothing that couldn't potentially be managed or overcome with time and therapy. Yet here she was, being reassigned to a dead-end position that might as well have been retirement. "Sir, I'm cleared for flight status. My last evaluation." "Your last evaluation showed acceptable performance," Webb interrupted, his tone sharpening like a blade being drawn. "Acceptable, not exceptional. Not what we need in a combat squadron." He stood, signaling the end of the conversation with the finality of a cell door closing. "Report to Hangar 7 at 0600 tomorrow. Your liaison will brief you on the aircraft." Sarah saluted, the movement automatic, drilled into her muscles through years of training at the Naval Academy and countless hours in the cockpit. As she turned to leave, Webb added, almost as an afterthought, "Try not to crash the damn thing. It may be old, but it's still Navy property." The words followed her out of the office, down the corridor, past the ready room where her former squadron mates were planning the day's training exercises. Through the window, she could see them clustered around the mission board, laughing at something Lieutenant Jake Morrison had said. Morrison had been her wingman once, had trusted her to cover his six in the most dangerous situations. Now he wouldn't even make eye contact. The ready room had once been Sarah's second home. She had spent countless hours there, studying mission parameters, debriefing after flights, bonding with the men and women who shared her passion for flying and her commitment to the mission. The room smelled of jet fuel and determination, a mixture that had always made her feel alive, focused, ready for anything. Now it just made her feel like an outsider, looking in through a window at a life that was no longer hers. Lieutenant Jake Morrison looked up as she passed, his expression carefully neutral, but she caught the whisper that followed her exit. Guess the brass finally figured out she can't hack it anymore. The words shouldn't have hurt. Sarah had heard worse in the weeks after her diagnosis, had endured the sideways glances and the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room. But they did hurt, each whisper another small cut, another reminder that she was no longer one of them. She was broken, damaged goods, a liability in a profession that demanded perfection. Morrison had been more than just a wingman. He had been a friend. They had gone through flight training together, had celebrated their first carrier landings together, had shared the unique bond that forms between people who regularly trust each other with their lives. But the TBI had changed that relationship, had introduced doubt where before there had been only trust. Sarah kept walking, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and for a moment, the corridor seemed to tilt and spin. She pressed her hand against the wall, waiting for the vertigo to pass, counting her breaths the way the Navy psychologist had taught her. 1, 2, 3. The world steadied, but the anger didn't subside. If anything, it grew stronger, a hot coal in her chest that refused to be extinguished. The vertigo was one of the most frustrating symptoms of the TBI. It came without warning, transforming the solid, reliable world into something fluid and uncertain. The doctors had explained that it was caused by damage to her vestibular system, the complex network of structures in the inner ear and brain that controlled balance and spatial orientation. They had assured her that it would likely improve with time, that her brain would adapt and compensate. But likely, and probably, weren't good enough when you were flying a multi-million-dollar aircraft at supersonic speeds. In aviation, certainty was everything. Hesitation could be fatal. And now Sarah was someone who couldn't always trust her own sense of up and down, left and right, fast and slow. She thought about the psychologist, Dr. Patricia Chen, no relation to David Chen, the civilian contractor she would meet tomorrow. Dr. Chen had kind eyes and a patient voice, and she had explained that the TBI would affect Sarah's life in ways both visible and invisible. "You'll have good days and bad days," she had said. "The important thing is to recognize your limitations and work within them." But Sarah didn't want to work within limitations. She wanted to fly, to push the envelope, to be the pilot she had trained her entire life to become. Limitations were for other people, for pilots who didn't have her determination or her skill. Except now, she was one of those other people, whether she wanted to admit it or not. Dr. Chen had been gentle but firm in her assessments. "You need to understand that your brain has been injured," she had explained during one of their sessions. "It's not a moral failing or a lack of willpower. It's a physical injury, just as real as a broken bone or a torn ligament. And like those injuries, it requires time to heal and may leave lasting effects that you'll need to adapt to." Sarah had nodded along, understanding the words intellectually, but resisting them emotionally. She had always been someone who could overcome obstacles through sheer force of will, who could outwork and outperform any challenge. The idea that there were limits beyond her control, that there were problems she couldn't simply power through, was deeply unsettling. The walk from Webb's office to her quarters felt longer than usual, each step weighted with the knowledge of what this reassignment really meant. Other pilots passed her in the corridors. Some nodded politely, others looked away. She could almost hear their thoughts. "There goes Mitchell. Used to be good. Shame what happened. Can't trust her anymore." The base seemed different now, transformed by her changed status from a place of belonging to a place of exile. The familiar landmarks, the mess hall where she had eaten countless meals with her squadron, the gym where she had maintained her physical fitness, the chapel where she had gone before particularly dangerous missions, all of them felt like they belonged to someone else's life now. Sarah had always prided herself on her resilience, on her ability to push through adversity. At the Naval Academy, she had been one of only 3 women in her flight training class, enduring not just the physical demands but also the subtle and not-so-subtle skepticism of instructors who believed women didn't belong in fighter cockpits. She had proven them wrong, graduating near the top of her class, earning her wings, building a reputation as a pilot who could handle anything. The academy had been brutally demanding, designed to weed out anyone who lacked the physical stamina, mental toughness, or technical aptitude required of a naval aviator. Sarah had excelled in the academic portions, studying aerodynamics and navigation and aircraft systems with the same intensity she brought to everything in her life. But she had also thrived in the physical training, pushing her body to its limits and beyond, refusing to give any instructor a reason to question whether she belonged. But this was different. The skepticism now wasn't about her gender or her background. It was about her brain, the organ that made everything else possible. And unlike the challenges she had faced before, this one couldn't be overcome through sheer determination or extra hours in the simulator. Her brain had been injured, and no amount of willpower could change that fundamental fact. The injury had happened so quickly, so unexpectedly, that Sarah sometimes still had trouble believing it was real. One moment she had been flying a perfect mission, every system nominal, every procedure executed flawlessly. The next moment, her world had exploded in light and sound and chaos. That night, Sarah sat in her quarters, staring at the file they had given her. The room was Spartan. A bed, a desk, a locker for her uniforms. On the wall hung a single photograph, Sarah and her father at her commissioning ceremony, both of them in dress whites, both of them smiling with pride. Her father had been a Navy pilot too, had flown combat missions in Desert Storm. He had always told her that the sky was the only place where she would truly be free. She wondered what he would think of her now, grounded not by enemy fire, but by the limitations of her own body. The photograph had been taken on one of the proudest days of Sarah's life. Her father had stood beside her, his chest covered with ribbons and medals from his own distinguished career, his eyes shining with pride as she accepted her commission. "You're going to be a great pilot," he had told her that day. "Better than I ever was. You have the instincts, the dedication, and the heart. Never forget that." But what good were instincts when your brain couldn't process information quickly enough? What value did dedication have when the very act of flying made you dizzy and disoriented? And what did heart matter when the people who were supposed to trust you no longer believed you were capable? Aircraft designation N-47B Ghost Hawk. The photos showed a plane that looked like it had been cobbled together from spare parts in some forgotten hangar. The fuselage was dull gray, the paint faded and chipped like an old car that had sat in the sun too long. The wings had an odd angular geometry that seemed wrong, inefficient, like someone had designed them using outdated software. Nothing about it suggested cutting-edge technology or tactical superiority. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a relic from another era, waiting to be decommissioned and forgotten. Sarah studied the photographs with a critical eye, noting every detail. The aircraft appeared to be based on designs from the 1980s, with none of the sleek lines or aggressive angles that characterized modern stealth fighters. The canopy was conventional, not the low-profile design that minimized radar cross-section. The engine intakes were visible from the front, a major vulnerability for any aircraft trying to avoid detection. Even the landing gear looked outdated, with exposed struts and conventional wheels rather than the more sophisticated systems used on contemporary fighters. Everything about the Ghost Hawk screamed obsolescence. It was the kind of aircraft that should be sitting in an aviation museum, behind velvet ropes with a placard explaining its historical significance. It certainly didn't look like something that should be flying active missions for the United States Navy. The technical specifications were sparse, almost deliberately vague. Top speed, classified. Range, classified. Weapon systems, none listed. It was as if someone had taken a standard naval fighter and stripped out everything that made it dangerous, leaving behind only the shell. Sarah flipped through the pages looking for something, anything that would make this assignment feel like more than a punishment. But there was nothing. Just page after page of redacted information and bureaucratic jargon. The file contained brief operational history, heavily redacted but suggesting that the Ghost Hawk had been in service for several years. There were references to successful deployment in contested environments and unique electronic warfare capabilities, but no specifics. The aircraft's performance characteristics were listed as adequate for mission parameters, which in military speak usually meant barely functional. Sarah closed the file and rubbed her temples, trying to ease the pressure building behind her eyes. The headaches had become a constant companion, arriving without warning and lingering for hours. The doctors had prescribed medication, but it only dulled the pain, never eliminated it. This was what her career had become, babysitting obsolete aircraft while the real pilots flew real missions. The TBI had taken more than just her sense of balance and her ability to process information quickly. It had taken her credibility, her place in the squadron, her identity as a warrior. The medication helped, but it also made her feel disconnected, like she was experiencing life through a thick fog. The doctors had explained that this was a common side effect, that she would need to find the right balance between managing the pain and maintaining mental clarity. But finding that balance had proven difficult. Too little medication and the headaches became debilitating. Too much and she felt like a passenger in her own body, watching events unfold without fully participating. She thought about the mission that had changed everything. They had been providing close air support for a SEAL team in a hot zone, somewhere in the mountains along the Afghan-Pakistan border. The intelligence had been good, the weather clear, the mission straightforward. Sarah had been flying low, providing cover while the SEALs extracted a high-value target from a fortified compound. Everything had been going according to plan until the RPG came out of nowhere. The intelligence briefing had indicated minimal hostile presence in the area, a few guards at most, armed with small arms and maybe one or two rocket-propelled grenades. The compound was supposed to be isolated, far from any significant enemy forces. The SEALs had gone in expecting light resistance, and Sarah's role had been purely precautionary. She was there to provide fire support if needed, but the mission planners hadn't expected her to engage. But the intelligence had been wrong, catastrophically wrong. The compound wasn't lightly defended. It was a staging area for a much larger force, and they had been expecting the SEALs, had prepared an ambush with weapons that the intelligence community hadn't known they possessed. The explosion hadn't hit her plane directly. If it had, she wouldn't be here now, wouldn't be sitting in this room feeling sorry for herself. Instead, the warhead had detonated 20 feet from her canopy, close enough that the shockwave had rattled her brain inside her skull like dice in a cup. For a moment, she had lost consciousness, her hands slipping from the controls, her plane beginning to spiral toward the ground. But training and instinct had kicked in, and she had pulled out of the dive, completed the mission, and brought the plane home. The actual impact had lasted perhaps a tenth of a second. A blinding flash of light, a deafening roar that seemed to come from inside her own head, a sensation of being violently shaken like a rag doll. Her vision had whited out completely, her hearing reduced to a high-pitched ringing that drowned out everything else. For a terrifying moment, she hadn't known which way was up, hadn't been able to tell if she was climbing or diving, accelerating or decelerating. Then her vision had begun to clear. The ringing in her ears had faded enough that she could hear her own breathing, harsh and rapid in her oxygen mask. She had found herself in a steep dive, the ground rushing up at her with terrifying speed. Her hands had moved automatically, pulling back on the stick, leveling the aircraft, checking her instruments to confirm she was actually flying level and not just hallucinating stable flight while still in a death spiral. She had walked away from the landing without visible injuries, had filed her after-action report, had even joined her squadron mates for drinks that night. It was only later, in the weeks that followed, that the symptoms had emerged. Headaches that felt like someone was driving nails into her skull, episodes of dizziness that made her question whether the horizon was real or imagined, moments of confusion when simple calculations became impossible. The first headache had come 3 days after the mission. Sarah had been in the ready room, studying mission parameters for an upcoming training exercise, when suddenly it felt like someone had driven an ice pick into her temple. The pain had been so intense, so unexpected, that she had actually gasped aloud, causing several of her squadron mates to look over in concern. "You okay, Mitchell?" Morrison had asked. Sarah had nodded, forcing a smile, lying through her teeth. "Yeah, just a tension headache. Too much time staring at screens." But the headache hadn't gone away. It had persisted for 6 hours, immune to over-the-counter painkillers, finally fading only when Sarah had retreated to her dark quarters and lay completely still. And it had been the first of many. The worst part wasn't the physical symptoms. It was the way people looked at her once they learned about the diagnosis. The skepticism in their eyes, the carefully worded concerns, the gradual erosion of trust. In a profession where your squadron mates needed to trust you with their lives, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Even a hint of unreliability was fatal to your career. Sarah had tried to hide the symptoms at first, had pushed through the headaches and dizziness and confusion, determined to prove that she was still capable. But the symptoms had gotten worse, had become impossible to conceal. During one training flight, she had experienced such severe vertigo that she had nearly crashed, pulling out of the dive only at the last possible second. The incident had been witnessed by her entire squadron, and after that, there had been no hiding the truth. The doctors had cleared her for flight status after 3 months of rehabilitation, but the whispers had already started. She's not the same. I heard she almost blacked out during a training run. You can't trust someone with a concussion to have your back in combat. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, until Commander Webb had called her into his office and delivered the news that would change everything. The rehabilitation had been frustrating in its own way. The doctors had put her through a battery of exercises designed to retrain her brain, to help it compensate for the damage. Balance exercises on unstable surfaces, cognitive tests that measured reaction time and information processing, vision therapy to address the tracking problems that sometimes made it difficult to follow moving objects. Sarah had attacked the rehabilitation with the same intensity she brought to everything, determined to prove that she could overcome this injury, just like she had overcome every other obstacle in her life. But progress had been slow, maddeningly so. Some days she felt almost normal. Other days the symptoms were as bad as they had been immediately after the injury. Sarah knew the whispers were partially true. She wasn't the same. The TBI had left its mark, had changed her in ways both subtle and profound. But she was still a damn good pilot, still capable, still willing to do the job. The problem was that in the Navy, good enough wasn't good enough. Excellence was the baseline, and anything less was seen as a liability. The Navy's standards for pilots were unforgiving, and for good reason. A single mistake, a moment of hesitation or confusion, could result in the loss of an aircraft worth tens of millions of dollars. Worse, it could result in the loss of lives, the pilot's own life, the lives of their squadron mates, or in the case of close air support missions, the lives of the ground forces depending on them. Sarah understood those standards. She had always supported them. But now that she was on the wrong side of them, now that she was the pilot being judged and found wanting, they felt cruel and arbitrary. She knew she could still fly. She knew she could still contribute, but the Navy had decided otherwise, and there was no appealing that decision. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the flight line. In the distance she could see the silhouettes of FA-18s, sleek and powerful, ready for combat. Those were the planes she should be flying, the missions she should be executing. Instead, she would be climbing into a faded junker tomorrow morning, testing systems that no one cared about, flying missions that didn't matter. The FA-18s looked beautiful in the fading light, their lines sharp and purposeful, every curve and angle optimized for performance. Sarah had logged hundreds of hours in Hornets, had mastered their quirks and limitations, had pushed them to their absolute limits in training and combat. She knew every switch, every gauge, every system. The Hornet had been more than just an aircraft to her. It had been a partner, an extension of her own will and skill, and now she would never fly one again. Not in combat, anyway. The Navy might allow her to fly training missions or ferry flights, but she would never again experience the intense rush of combat flying, the adrenaline surge that came from pushing herself and her aircraft to their absolute limits in life-or-death situations. Sarah closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to come. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry, wouldn't show weakness, wouldn't give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. But alone in her quarters, with no one watching, she allowed herself a moment of grief for the career that should have been hers. The tears came despite her best efforts to hold them back. They traced hot paths down her cheeks, and Sarah let them fall, too exhausted to maintain the facade of strength any longer. For months she had been holding everything together, presenting a brave face to the world even as everything she had worked for crumbled around her. But in this moment, alone in her room with only her thoughts for company, she finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her loss. She thought about her father again, about the stories he used to tell her when she was young. He had faced his own challenges, had been shot down over Iraq, had spent 3 days evading enemy forces before being rescued. He had always emphasized that being a warrior wasn't just about physical courage, it was about mental resilience. the ability to adapt when circumstances changed, the willingness to find new ways to serve even when the old ways were no longer available. Her father had told her about those 3 days in the Iraqi desert dozens of times, and Sarah had never tired of hearing the story. He had ejected from his damaged F-14 at high altitude, parachuting down into hostile territory with nothing but his survival kit and his training. For 3 days he had evaded enemy patrols, moving only at night, hiding during the day in whatever cover he could find. He had been hungry, thirsty, terrified, but he had never given up, had never stopped believing that he would make it home. On the 3rd day, a search and rescue helicopter had found him, extracting him under fire while enemy forces closed in. Her father had always emphasized that the experience had taught him an important lesson, that survival wasn't about being the strongest or the fastest or the best equipped. It was about being adaptable, about finding ways to overcome whatever obstacles you faced, about refusing to give up even when the situation seemed hopeless. Maybe this assignment was a test of that resilience. Maybe the question wasn't whether she could still fly the same missions she had flown before, but whether she could adapt to a new role, a new challenge, a new way of serving. Or maybe that was just wishful thinking, a way to rationalize what was clearly the end of her career as a combat pilot. Sarah opened her eyes and looked at the photograph on her wall one more time. Her father had died 2 years ago, long before her injury, long before any of this had happened. He had suffered a massive heart attack while mowing his lawn on a Saturday afternoon, dying instantly according to the autopsy. Sarah had been on deployment when it happened, unable to get home in time for the funeral. By the time her squadron returned to port, her father had been buried for 3 weeks. She wished he could be here now, to offer advice, to help her understand what she was supposed to do next. Her father had always known what to say, had always been able to put things in perspective. He would have understood what she was going through in a way that few others could, because he had been through his own trials, had faced his own doubts and fears and moments of uncertainty. But she was on her own, and she would have to figure this out herself. Sarah turned off the light and lay down on her bed, but sleep was a long time coming. Her mind kept circling back to the same questions. What was the Ghost Hawk really? Why had they assigned her to it? And what would tomorrow bring? The questions played on an endless loop, each one leading to another, none of them finding satisfactory answers. Sarah tried the relaxation techniques Dr. Chen had taught her, tried focusing on her breathing, tried clearing her mind, but nothing worked. Her thoughts kept returning to the Ghost Hawk, to the cryptic file, to the mystery of why the Navy would assign a pilot with a TBI to evaluate a supposedly obsolete aircraft. Finally, sometime after midnight, exhaustion won out over anxiety, and Sarah drifted into an uneasy sleep. Her dreams were filled with images of flying, but not the smooth, controlled flight she was used to. Instead, she dreamed of tumbling through the sky, unable to tell which way was up, her instruments spinning wildly, the horizon tilting at impossible angles. She woke several times during the night, her heart pounding, unsure for a moment where she was. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Hangar 7 before dawn, the sky still dark except for a faint glow on the eastern horizon. She had barely slept, her mind racing with questions about the assignment, about the aircraft, about what her future would look like. The building was isolated, separated from the main flight line by a quarter-mile of empty tarmac, as if the Navy wanted to keep whatever was inside hidden from casual observation. The isolation of Hangar 7 was striking. Most of the base's facilities were clustered together, creating a sense of community and shared purpose. But this hangar stood alone, surrounded by empty space, accessible only by a single access road that branched off from the main thoroughfare. There were no other buildings nearby, no personnel casually walking past. The area felt abandoned, forgotten. The hangar itself was nondescript, a standard military structure painted in the same dull colors as every other building on the base. But there was something different about it, something Sarah couldn't quite identify. The windows were darker than standard issue, almost opaque. The security measures seemed more extensive than necessary for a facility that supposedly housed obsolete aircraft, and there was a stillness around the building, an absence of the usual activity that characterized working hangars. Sarah noted the security cameras mounted at regular intervals around the building's perimeter, their lenses tracking her approach. The door was reinforced steel rather than the standard aluminum used in most hangars, and the lock was a sophisticated biometric system rather than a simple keypad or card reader. These were not the security measures you would use for a facility housing aircraft that were being evaluated for decommission. The doors were closed, and a single figure stood waiting outside, a man in his 50s wearing a civilian contractor's badge and an expression that suggested he had seen too much and believed too little. He was shorter than Sarah had expected, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the appearance of a professor rather than someone involved in military operations. David Chen looked like someone who would be more at home in a university lecture hall than on a military base. He wore khaki pants and a button-down shirt, both slightly rumpled, and carried a worn leather satchel that probably contained technical manuals and design specifications. But his eyes were sharp and assessing, and the way he carried himself suggested a military background, even if he was now working as a civilian. "Captain Mitchell?" he asked, extending a hand. "I'm David Chen, your liaison for this project. Welcome to the program." Sarah shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that suggested he had once been more than just a bureaucrat. His handshake reminded her of her father's, confident without being aggressive, respectful without being deferential. "What exactly is this program, Mr. Chen?" Chen smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was something guarded about him, as if he was constantly calculating how much information to reveal. "That depends on who you ask. Officially, you're evaluating legacy aircraft for potential decommission. Unofficially," he paused, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers, though the tarmac was empty except for the two of them. "Unofficially, you're about to fly something that doesn't officially exist." He entered a code on the keypad beside the hangar door, his fingers moving quickly over the numbers. Sarah noticed that he positioned his body to block her view of the keypad, a security measure that suggested this wasn't just a routine access code. The massive structure began to open with a mechanical groan, the sound echoing across the empty flight line. As the gap widened, Sarah caught her first glimpse of the Ghost Hawk in person, and her initial reaction was disappointment mixed with confusion. The photos hadn't done justice to how utterly unremarkable the plane looked. It sat in the center of the hangar like a forgotten relic, its paint so faded it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The fuselage was covered in patches and repairs, some of them obviously newer than others, creating a patchwork appearance that suggested decades of service. The wings were slightly swept back, but not in the aggressive angles of modern stealth fighters. Instead, they had an almost awkward geometry, as if the designer hadn't quite committed to any particular aerodynamic philosophy. Up close, the Ghost Hawk looked even worse than in the photographs. The paint wasn't just faded, it was actively peeling in some places, revealing bare metal underneath. There were streaks of what looked like oil or hydraulic fluid staining the underside of the fuselage. One of the access panels was slightly misaligned, creating a small gap that would have failed any standard maintenance inspection. The landing gear struts showed signs of corrosion, and the tires looked like they were long overdue for replacement. "This is what I'm supposed to evaluate?" Sarah asked, unable to keep the skepticism out of her voice. She had flown dozens of different aircraft during her career, from training planes to state-of-the-art fighters, and she had never seen anything quite like this. It looked like something that should be in a museum, not on an active flight line. "This is what you're supposed to fly," Chen corrected, his voice taking on a slight edge. "The evaluation is secondary." As they walked closer, Sarah began to notice details that didn't quite fit. The faded paint, when viewed from certain angles, seemed to shimmer with an iridescent quality, like oil on water. The cockpit canopy was darker than standard issue, almost opaque from the outside, making it impossible to see into the interior. The control surfaces had an unusual number of micro-actuators, far more than would be needed for conventional flight, their presence suggesting a level of sophistication that contradicted the plane's decrepit appearance. The micro-actuators were fascinating. Sarah had studied advanced flight control systems at the academy, had written papers on the evolution of fly-by-wire technology. She knew that conventional aircraft used relatively few control surfaces, ailerons for roll, elevators for pitch, rudders for yaw. But the Ghost Hawk seemed to have dozens of tiny actuators scattered across its wings and tail surfaces, each one capable of making minute adjustments to the airflow. This level of control was unprecedented in aircraft design, at least in any aircraft Sarah had encountered. The F-22 and F-35 had sophisticated flight control systems, but nothing like this. The sheer number of actuators suggested that the Ghost Hawk could manipulate its aerodynamic properties in ways that conventional aircraft couldn't. potentially adjusting its performance characteristics in real time based on mission requirements. The landing gear was heavier than it should be, reinforced in ways that suggested the aircraft could operate from rough terrain or damaged runways. The engine intakes were designed with an unusual baffle system that Sarah recognized from her studies of stealth technology, a way to hide the engine's radar signature while maintaining airflow. But the implementation was different from anything she had seen before, more subtle, more integrated into the overall design. Sarah crouched down to examine the landing gear more closely. The struts were definitely reinforced, probably capable of handling much rougher landings than the aircraft's appearance suggested. The wheels themselves were interesting. They appeared to be standard naval aircraft tires, but there was something odd about the tread pattern. It looked almost deliberate, designed to create specific marks on a runway or taxiway. The engine intakes were works of art. Sarah could see multiple layers of baffles, each one carefully positioned to disrupt radar waves while allowing air to flow freely to the engines. The system was far more sophisticated than the simple S-shaped ducts used in many stealth aircraft. This was bleeding-edge aeronautical engineering hidden beneath a facade of obsolescence. There were other anomalies, too, once Sarah knew to look for them. The rivets on the fuselage were irregularly spaced, breaking up what would otherwise be regular patterns that radar could detect. The antenna arrays were hidden in places that seemed random but were probably carefully calculated. Even the weathering on the paint appeared deliberate, designed to create specific patterns that would confuse optical tracking systems. "What's the actual designation?" Sarah asked, running her hand along the fuselage. The metal was cool to the touch, and she could feel the slight irregularities where different materials had been bonded together. N-47B isn't standard nomenclature. Continue 1:24 p.m. mature. Chen hesitated, and Sarah saw him weighing how much to reveal. His eyes flickered to the security cameras mounted in the corners of the hangar, then back to her face. Finally, he said, "The project name is X-47. The official designation is classified, but you can call it the Ghost Hawk. It's a fifth-generation stealth fighter with capabilities that, well, you'll see." Stealth? Sarah circled the aircraft, her trained eye picking out anomalies. The more she looked, the more questions she had. This doesn't have the profile of a stealth fighter. The angles are all wrong. The F-22 and F-35 have very specific geometries designed to minimize radar cross-section. This looks like it was designed by committee, with everyone wanting something different. "That's because it's not passive stealth," Chen explained, walking to stand beside her. "The X-47 uses active countermeasures, electronic warfare systems that can bend radar waves, spoof tracking systems, and jam communications across multiple frequencies simultaneously. The exterior is deliberately designed to look obsolete. It's camouflage." Sarah stopped, turning to face him. The implications of what he was saying began to sink in. "You're telling me the Navy built a state-of-the-art stealth fighter and made it look like junk? I'm telling you that sometimes the best way to hide something is to make people think it's not worth looking at," Chen replied. His voice had taken on a professorial quality, as if he were lecturing a class on military strategy. "Think about it, Captain. Every nation with a military aviation program knows what a stealth fighter looks like. They know the angles, the materials, the engine configurations. They've built entire defensive systems designed to detect and track those specific signatures. The Ghost Hawk bypasses all of that by simply not looking like what it is." He gestured toward the aircraft with obvious pride. "The X-47 has been operational for 3 years. In that time, it's flown over 100 missions in contested airspace. Syria, the South China Sea, the Baltic region, even incursions into Russian and Chinese airspace that will never be officially acknowledged. And not once has an enemy radar system successfully tracked it. Not once." The implications were staggering. If what Chen was saying was true, then this ugly, fated aircraft represented a quantum leap in aerial warfare. It wasn't just about avoiding detection, it was about actively controlling the enemy's perception of reality. But that raised another question, one that made Sarah's chest tighten with a familiar anxiety. "Why me?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "If this plane is so important, why assign a pilot with a TBI to fly it? Why not give it to someone from the squadron, someone without medical restrictions?" Chen's expression softened, and for the first time, Sarah saw something like respect in his eyes. He removed his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt, a gesture that seemed designed to give him time to formulate his answer. "Because the X-47 requires a different kind of flying. It's not about pure reflexes or split-second decisions. It's not about pulling 8Gs in a dogfight or threading the needle through enemy fire. Those skills are valuable, but they're not what this aircraft needs. He replaced his glasses and looked directly at her. The Ghost Hawk requires patience, observation, and the ability to think 3 moves ahead. The AI handles most of the tactical responses, the immediate threats, the defensive maneuvers, the split-second calculations. The pilot's job is to be the strategic brain, the human element that can adapt when the algorithms fail, that can see patterns the computer misses, that can make judgment calls based on intuition and experience rather than just data. He paused, letting his words sink in. And because you understand what it's like to be underestimated, you know what it's like to have people look at you and see only limitations, only weaknesses, only reasons why you can't succeed. The Ghost Hawk has been underestimated its entire operational life. Every pilot who's seen it has dismissed it as junk, as a waste of resources. That's exactly what makes it so effective. The words hit Sarah harder than she expected. She looked back at the Ghost Hawk, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't a punishment or a demotion. It was a mission, one that required exactly the skills she had been told were no longer valuable. The TBI had forced her to slow down, to think more carefully, to rely on strategy rather than pure instinct. Those changes, which had seemed like disabilities in a conventional fighter, might actually be advantages in this aircraft. Chen's words resonated with something deep inside Sarah. For months, she had been fighting against her limitations, trying to be the pilot she was before the injury, measuring herself against a standard she could no longer meet. But what if that was the wrong approach? What if instead of fighting against her changes, she should be embracing them, finding ways to turn her adaptations into strengths? The Ghost Hawk was a perfect metaphor for her own situation. On the surface, it looked like a failure, like something that should be scrapped and forgotten. But beneath that exterior lurked capabilities that far exceeded what anyone would expect. Maybe Sarah was the same, not broken or diminished, but simply different, with capabilities that weren't immediately obvious to those who only looked at her medical records. "When do we start?" she asked. Chen smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "How about now? Let's get you familiar with the cockpit." The next 2 hours were a revelation. Chen walked Sarah through every system on the Ghost Hawk, explaining not just what each component did, but why it had been designed that way. The aircraft was a masterpiece of deception, with layers upon layers of misdirection built into every aspect of its construction. The briefing took place in a small office adjacent to the hangar, a room filled with technical manuals, computer monitors, and what looked like years' worth of mission data. Chen pulled up schematics and diagrams on a large monitor, walking Sarah through the Ghost Hawk's design philosophy with the enthusiasm of someone describing their favorite work of art. The faded paint wasn't just camouflage. It was embedded with metamaterials that could absorb and redirect electromagnetic radiation across multiple spectrums. Chen explained that the metamaterials were arranged in specific patterns, creating what he called electromagnetic traps that would capture incoming radar waves and redirect them away from their source, rather than reflecting them back. Traditional stealth technology tries to minimize radar reflection by using specific angles and radar-absorbent materials, Chen explained, pointing to a cross-section diagram of the Ghost Hawk's skin. But there are limits to that approach. You can reduce your radar cross-section, but you can never eliminate it entirely. The Ghost Hawk takes a different approach. It actively manipulates the radar waves, using metamaterials to bend them around the aircraft or redirect them in unpredictable directions. He pulled up another diagram showing the microscopic structure of the paint. The metamaterials are arranged in a fractal pattern that responds to different frequencies in different ways. The same square inch of surface might absorb X-band radar while reflecting S-band radar at an angle that makes the aircraft appear to be in a different location. It's not about being invisible. It's about being impossible to accurately track. The odd angles of the wings weren't a design flaw, but a deliberate choice to create turbulence patterns that confused acoustic tracking systems. Chen showed Sarah wind tunnel footage demonstrating how the Ghost Hawk's design created vortices and pressure waves that would appear on acoustic sensors as multiple smaller objects rather than a single large aircraft. Acoustic tracking is becoming increasingly important as radar technology advances, Chen explained. Some countries are developing systems that use arrays of sensitive microphones to track aircraft by the sound they make. The Ghost Hawk's aerodynamic design is specifically optimized to confuse these systems, creating acoustic signatures that don't match any known aircraft profile. Even the patches and repairs were part of the deception, making the aircraft look like it had decades of wear when in reality it had only been operational for 3 years. Chen showed Sarah close-up photographs of individual patches, explaining how each one had been carefully weathered and aged to create a consistent appearance of long-term use. "We studied aircraft that had been in service for 20 or 30 years, Chen said, pulling up comparison photographs. "We analyzed the patterns of wear and corrosion, the types of repairs that accumulate over time, the way paint fades and chips in specific patterns. Then we reproduced all of that artificially on the Ghost Hawk. If an enemy analyst examines this aircraft, either visually or through satellite imagery, they'll conclude it's been in service since the 1980s or early 1990s. They'll dismiss it as obsolete, not worth their attention. Every aspect of the Ghost Hawk is designed to exploit cognitive biases," Chen explained as they examined the exterior through the office window. "When people see something that looks old and worn, they make assumptions about its capabilities. They dismiss it as irrelevant, not worth their attention. That dismissal is a weapon we can use against them." He pointed to one of the patches on the fuselage, visible even from this distance. "This, for example, looks like a field repair done years ago, but it's actually a sophisticated sensor array that can detect and analyze electromagnetic emissions across dozens of frequency bands. The weathered appearance makes enemy analysts assume it's just structural maintenance, not active electronics." Chen walked over to a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder containing what looked like intelligence assessments from various foreign militaries. "We've intercepted communications and documents from Russian, Chinese, Iranian, and North Korean intelligence services. In every case where they've observed the Ghost Hawk, and they have observed it, through satellite imagery and electronic intelligence, they've dismissed it as an obsolete trainer or transport aircraft. Their analysts look at it and see exactly what we want them to see, a worn-out relic that poses no threat. But the real magic was in the electronic warfare suite. Sarah had seen EW systems before. Every modern fighter had some capability to jam radar or spoof missiles. But the Ghost Hawk systems were on another level entirely. The aircraft could identify every radar emission within a 200-mile radius, classify each system by type and threat level, and then selectively jam or spoof each one with tailored countermeasures. Chen pulled up a display showing the electromagnetic environment around a typical military installation. The screen was filled with colored lines and symbols, each one representing a different emitter: surface-to-air missile radars, early warning radars, fighter aircraft radars, communication systems, navigation aids, even civilian cell phone towers. "This is what the Ghost Hawk sees," Chen explained. "Every electromagnetic emission in the environment, classified and analyzed in real time. The system can tell the difference between a Russian S-400 radar and a Chinese HQ-9 radar. It knows the operational characteristics, the scanning patterns, the frequencies each system uses, and more importantly, it knows their vulnerabilities. It's like playing chess with 50 opponents simultaneously," Chen explained as Sarah studied the displays. "The system tracks every threat, predicts how each one will respond to different stimuli, and then executes a strategy designed to maximize confusion while minimizing the risk of detection. And it does all of this in real time, updating constantly as new threats emerge or old ones adapt." Chen pulled up a diagram showing the architecture of the electronic warfare system. "The Ghost Hawk doesn't just jam signals indiscriminately. That's crude, and it reveals your position. Instead, it analyzes each threat individually, understands how that specific radar or communication system works, and then crafts a deception tailored to that system's characteristics." He pointed to different components on the diagram. "For example, if we detect a Russian S-400 radar system, the Ghost Hawk knows exactly how that system processes returns, what kind of targets it's designed to detect, what its limitations are. We can then feed it false data that falls within its operational parameters, targets that seem real to the S-400, but are actually phantom returns we've created." The sophistication of the system was almost overwhelming. Chen showed Sarah examples from previous missions where the Ghost Hawk had spoofed enemy radar systems into seeing entire fighter squadrons that didn't exist, or had made a single aircraft appear to be a flock of birds, or had created phantom cruise missiles that drew defensive fire away from real targets. "The key is understanding the enemy's expectations," Chen said. "Every radar system, every sensor, is designed to detect certain types of threats. The operators have been trained to look for specific signatures, specific patterns. The Ghost Hawk exploits that training, that expectation, by giving them exactly what they're looking for, but in the wrong place, or with the wrong characteristics, or at the wrong time. Sarah was fascinated by the complexity of the system, but also slightly overwhelmed. The cognitive load required to monitor and direct these systems seemed immense. How does the pilot manage all of this without being overwhelmed? That's where the AI comes in, Chen said. The Ghost Hawk's computer doesn't just execute commands, it anticipates them. It learns your decision-making patterns, your priorities, your risk tolerance. Over time, it becomes an extension of your own thinking, handling the routine tasks so you can focus on the strategic decisions. He pulled up a display showing the AI's interface. The screen was surprisingly clean, devoid of the cluttered information overload that characterized many military systems. Instead, there were simple, intuitive displays that highlighted key threats and suggested responses without overwhelming the pilot with raw data. The system will highlight threats it thinks you need to be aware of, suggest responses, and execute defensive maneuvers automatically if it detects immediate danger. But it never takes control away from you. You're always the final authority, the one making the decisions that matter. Chen walked Sarah through several scenarios, showing her how the AI would present information and recommendations. In one scenario, the Ghost Hawk detected multiple radar emissions from different types of systems: a fighter aircraft, a surface-to-air missile site, and a ground-based early warning radar. The AI automatically classified each threat by priority, suggested specific countermeasures for each one, and predicted how the enemy would likely respond to different actions the pilot might take. The AI is constantly running simulations, Chen explained. It's modeling the electromagnetic environment, predicting how the enemy will react to different stimuli, calculating probabilities of detection or engagement. It's like having a team of electronic warfare experts and tactical analysts sitting right there in the cockpit with you, processing information and providing recommendations at machine speed. The interface was surprisingly intuitive, designed to augment human decision-making rather than replace it. The AI identified patterns, calculated probabilities, and suggested courses of action, but it always deferred to the pilot's judgment. The system is built on the principle that humans and AI have complementary strengths, Chen explained. The AI is better at processing vast amounts of data, at making calculations, at responding to immediate threats with superhuman speed. But humans are better at understanding context, at recognizing patterns that fall outside expected parameters, at making judgment calls based on incomplete information. He pulled up a mission briefing from a previous Ghost Hawk operation. In this mission, the Ghost Hawk was operating near the Syrian border when it detected a new type of radar emission that wasn't in its database. The AI couldn't classify the threat or suggest appropriate countermeasures. A purely autonomous system would have either ignored the threat or responded with generic jamming that might have revealed the aircraft's position. But the pilot, a Marine captain named Rodriguez, recognized that the emission pattern was similar to an upgraded version of a Russian system. He manually programmed a spoofing strategy based on his knowledge of how the original system worked, adapting it for the new variant. The countermeasures were successful, and the intelligence about the new radar system was valuable in itself. That's the kind of adaptability that only a human can provide. Sarah nodded, beginning to understand why this aircraft might be perfect for someone with her condition. The TBI had made it harder for her to process multiple inputs simultaneously, had slowed her reaction time slightly, had made split-second decisions more difficult. But the Ghost Hawk's AI could compensate for those limitations, acting as a cognitive prosthetic that amplified her strengths while minimizing her weaknesses. It was a humbling realization that her injury, which had seemed like the end of her career, might actually make her better suited for this particular mission. The Ghost Hawk needed a pilot who could think strategically, who could see the big picture, who could resist the temptation to react instinctively to every threat. Someone who had learned, through painful necessity, to slow down and think before acting. The realization brought with it a complex mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, that there might be a path forward for her career, but also a strange kind of grief for the pilot she had been before the injury. That Sarah Mitchell had been defined by her quick reflexes, her ability to process information at incredible speeds, her talent for making the right decision in a fraction of a second. This new Sarah Mitchell would be different, slower perhaps, more deliberate, but potentially more effective in the right context. What about weapons? Sarah asked, noticing that the specifications she had reviewed the previous night had listed no armaments. Chen's expression became more guarded. The Ghost Hawk carries no traditional weapons, no missiles, no bombs, no guns. Its only armament is information, the ability to see without being seen, to deceive without being detected, to control the battlefield without firing a shot. But what if I encounter a threat that requires kinetic response? Sarah pressed. What if jamming and spoofing aren't enough? Then you evade and call for support, Chen said simply. The Ghost Hawk isn't designed for dogfights or air-to-ground strikes. It's designed for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance missions, where the primary goal is to gather information or create opportunities for other assets. Think of it as a force multiplier. It makes every other aircraft and weapon system more effective by giving them better information and creating tactical advantages. He pulled up footage from a previous mission, showing the Ghost Hawk operating in conjunction with a strike package. The video showed a complex military installation with multiple layers of air defenses, radar sites, surface-to-air missiles, and fighter aircraft on patrol. The Ghost Hawk had penetrated this defensive network, identified gaps and weaknesses, and then coordinated with conventional strike aircraft to exploit those vulnerabilities. In this operation, the Ghost Hawk identified gaps in enemy air defenses, jammed their communication networks, and created false targets that drew their attention away from the actual strike aircraft. The result was a successful mission with 0 losses, because the enemy never knew what hit them. Sarah considered this. It was a different philosophy of warfare, one that prioritized intelligence over firepower, deception over destruction. In some ways, it felt less like being a warrior and more like being a spy. But she could see the strategic value. A single Ghost Hawk, operating undetected in enemy airspace, could provide intelligence that would allow conventional forces to operate with far greater effectiveness. It also aligned with her father's philosophy, that being a warrior wasn't just about pulling triggers or dropping bombs, but about understanding the battlefield, about finding ways to achieve objectives with minimum risk to friendly forces. He had always emphasized that the best battles were the ones you won without fighting, the enemy defeated before they even knew they were in danger. Her father had often quoted Sun Tzu, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting." At the time, Sarah had understood this intellectually, but had never fully appreciated its implications. She had been too focused on the excitement of aerial combat, on the adrenaline rush of dogfighting and ground attack missions. But now, facing a different kind of warfare, she began to understand what her father had been trying to teach her. Winning without fighting didn't mean avoiding combat. It meant shaping the battlefield so thoroughly that the enemy had no effective response when combat came. It meant controlling information, manipulating perceptions, creating conditions that made victory inevitable before the first shot was fired. The Ghost Hawk embodied this philosophy in every aspect of its design and operation. "All right," Sarah said, "let's see what this thing can do." The first flight was scheduled for that afternoon, giving Sarah time to review the technical manuals and familiarize herself with the Ghost Hawk systems in more detail. She spent the morning in a small office adjacent to the hangar, poring over documents and watching recorded footage from previous missions. The office was cramped but functional, with a desk, a computer, and walls lined with filing cabinets containing technical documentation. Chen had provided her with a classified tablet loaded with mission recordings, flight manuals, and technical specifications. Sarah settled in with a cup of coffee and began working through the material systematically. The missions were extraordinary. She watched as Ghost Hawks had penetrated some of the most heavily defended airspace in the world, flying within miles of advanced surface-to-air missile systems without ever being detected. She saw footage of enemy fighters passing within visual range, their pilots completely unaware of the Ghost Hawk's presence. She watched as the aircraft had provided real-time intelligence during special operations raids, guiding strike packages through gaps in enemy defenses that shouldn't have existed. One mission recorded over Syria showed a Ghost Hawk operating in airspace protected by Russian S-400 missile systems, some of the most advanced air defense weapons in the world. The S-400 had a theoretical range of over 200 miles and could engage targets from near ground level to altitudes exceeding 100,000 feet. It was designed specifically to defeat stealth aircraft, using multiple radar frequencies and sophisticated signal processing to detect even the smallest radar returns. But on the Ghost Hawk's recording, The S-400 radars swept past the aircraft repeatedly without ever achieving a lock. The Ghost Hawk's electronic warfare system identified each radar sweep, analyzed its characteristics in milliseconds, and then fed back false returns that made the radar believe it was detecting nothing more threatening than a small civilian aircraft far from the protected airspace. At one point in the recording, a Syrian fighter aircraft passed within 2 miles of the Ghost Hawk, close enough that Sarah could see details of the other aircraft in the video feed. The fighter pilot was obviously searching for something, his head moving as he scanned the sky, his aircraft maneuvering in a search pattern, but he never saw the Ghost Hawk, never even suspected that there was another aircraft nearby. One mission particularly stood out. A Ghost Hawk had operated over Syria, providing intelligence for a hostage rescue operation. The aircraft had identified the location of the hostages, mapped the positions of enemy forces, jammed communication networks to prevent reinforcements from being called, and created phantom radar returns that drew enemy fighters away from the actual operation. The SEALs had completed the rescue without firing a shot, because the enemy had been so thoroughly confused about what was happening. Sarah watched the mission recording multiple times, studying how the Ghost Hawk pilot had orchestrated the deception. It was like watching a master chess player manipulate the board, moving pieces that the opponent couldn't see, creating threats that didn't exist, exploiting weaknesses that the enemy didn't know they had. The pilot had started by identifying all the electromagnetic emitters in the area, communication towers, radar sites, cell phone signals, even the walkie-talkies used by enemy guards. Then, working with the SEAL team's ground commander, she had systematically disrupted each communication node at precisely the right moment to maximize confusion while minimizing the chance of detection. When enemy reinforcements began moving toward the target area, the Ghost Hawk created phantom radio traffic suggesting that a much larger attack was happening at a different location. The reinforcements diverted to respond to the false threat, leaving the actual target area vulnerable. By the time the enemy realized they had been deceived, the SEALs and their rescued hostages were already safely away. But what impressed Sarah most was the creativity of the tactics. In one mission, a Ghost Hawk had made itself appear to be an entire squadron of aircraft, forcing enemy fighters to waste fuel and munitions chasing phantoms. In another, the aircraft had impersonated a civilian airliner, allowing it to fly through supposedly restricted airspace without raising alarms. And in a third, the Ghost Hawk had created the illusion of a massive air assault, causing enemy forces to redeploy their defenses and leaving their original positions vulnerable to attack. The mission where the Ghost Hawk impersonated an airliner was particularly fascinating. The aircraft had entered restricted airspace over the South China Sea, an area heavily patrolled by Chinese fighters and monitored by sophisticated radar networks. Rather than trying to sneak through invisibly, the Ghost Hawk had brazenly broadcast the transponder code of a commercial Boeing 777 flying from Singapore to Shanghai. On Chinese radar screens, the Ghost Hawk appeared to be exactly what it claimed to be, a civilian airliner on a routine flight path. When Chinese air traffic controllers attempted to contact the airliner, the Ghost Hawk's AI generated responses using synthesized voices, confirming altitudes and headings, requesting minor course corrections to avoid weather. The deception was so complete that Chinese fighters never even scrambled to investigate. Meanwhile, the Ghost Hawk had been collecting intelligence on Chinese military installations, mapping radar coverage, intercepting communications, and building a detailed picture of Chinese defensive capabilities in the region. By the time it exited the area and resumed its actual identity, it had gathered intelligence that would have been impossible to obtain through any other means. These weren't just technical achievements, they were works of art, demonstrations of how information and deception could be weaponized in ways that conventional firepower never could be. Each mission required careful planning, precise execution, and the ability to adapt when circumstances changed. The Ghost Hawk pilots weren't just flying aircraft, they were orchestrating complex deceptions, managing multiple layers of misdirection, thinking several moves ahead like grandmasters playing chess. Sarah also noticed something else in the mission footage. The pilots operated with a calmness that was unusual in combat aviation. There was none of the aggressive energy that characterized traditional fighter missions, none of the adrenaline-fueled maneuvering. Instead, the Ghost Hawk pilots moved deliberately, making careful choices, adjusting their strategies based on how the enemy responded. It was a different kind of flying, one that prioritized thought over reaction, strategy over instinct. The contrast with conventional fighter missions was striking. Sarah had flown dozens of combat sorties in FA-18s, and they were invariably characterized by high stress, rapid maneuvering, and split-second decision-making. There was an intensity to fighter combat that was exhilarating, but also exhausting, demanding constant alertness and instant reactions. But the Ghost Hawk missions had a different quality. The pilots spoke in measured tones, explained their reasoning, discussed options with ground controllers. There was time to think, to consider multiple approaches, to choose the optimal strategy rather than simply reacting to immediate threats. It was chess rather than boxing, strategy rather than tactics, thought rather than reflex. Sarah found herself wondering if she could adapt to this different style of flying. Her entire career had been built on quick reactions, aggressive maneuvering, the ability to make the right decision in a fraction of a second. Could she slow down, be patient, resist the instinct to react immediately to every threat? Maybe. Maybe the TBI had already forced her to develop exactly those skills. She had learned, through painful necessity, to pause before acting, to think through her options, to compensate for the fact that her brain no longer processed information at its former speed. Those adaptations, which had seemed like disabilities in a conventional fighter, might actually be perfectly suited to the Ghost Hawk's operational requirements. Sarah reported to the hangar at 1400 hours, suited up and ready. Chen was waiting, along with a small crew of technicians who moved around the aircraft with practiced efficiency. They worked in near silence, communicating with hand signals and brief verbal commands, their movements coordinated like a well-rehearsed dance. The technicians were an interesting group. Sarah noticed that several of them wore civilian contractor badges rather than military identification, suggesting they had been specifically recruited for this program. They handled the Ghost Hawk with a familiarity that came from years of experience, knowing exactly which panels to check, which systems to test, which quirks and idiosyncrasies to watch for. One technician, an older man with gray hair and weathered hands, was performing a detailed inspection of the wing surfaces. Sarah watched as he ran his hands over the faded paint, feeling for imperfections, checking that each micro-actuator was properly aligned. His movements had the quality of a craftsman inspecting his work, taking pride in ensuring everything was perfect. As Sarah climbed into the cockpit, she felt a strange sense of homecoming. This was where she belonged, not in a commander's office being lectured about acceptable performance, but in the pilot's seat, surrounded by instruments and controls, poised on the edge of the sky. The familiar smell of aviation fuel and electronics filled her nostrils, grounding her in the present moment. The Ghost Hawk's cockpit was surprisingly comfortable, designed for long-duration missions rather than the cramped efficiency of modern fighters. The ejection seat was well padded, with lumbar support and adjustable headrests. The throttle and stick were positioned ergonomically, requiring minimal reach. Even the displays were positioned to minimize eye strain, recognizing that Ghost Hawk pilots might spend many hours in the cockpit during a single mission. The Ghost Hawk's cockpit was Spartan compared to modern fighters. There were no flashy displays or holographic interfaces, no voice-activated systems or gesture controls. Instead, the instruments were analog, old school, the kind of setup that would have been familiar to pilots from decades ago. The altimeter was mechanical, with physical needles pointing to numbers on a dial. The artificial horizon used gyroscopic technology that predated solid-state electronics. Even the throttle and stick were purely mechanical, with no fly-by-wire assistance visible. But beneath that retro exterior, Sarah could sense the hidden technology, the sensors embedded in every surface, the AI listening to her every command, the systems waiting to be activated. It was like sitting in a vintage car that had been retrofitted with a Formula One engine. The exterior suggested one thing, but the reality was something else entirely. Sarah ran her hands over the controls, feeling their weight and responsiveness. The stick had just the right amount of resistance, providing tactile feedback without being difficult to move. The throttle clicked smoothly through its range, from idle to full military power. Even the rudder pedals felt perfectly balanced, requiring just enough pressure to be precise without being tiring. Chen's voice came through her headset. The analog instruments are part of the deception, but they're also functional. If all the electronics fail, you can still fly the Ghost Hawk using basic instruments. It's designed to be resilient, to keep operating even when systems are damaged or compromised. Sarah nodded, running through the pre-flight checklist. The process was both familiar and strange. Familiar because the basic procedures were the same as any aircraft. Strange because she knew that beneath the conventional exterior lurked systems unlike anything she had flown before. The checklist was refreshingly straightforward. No complex startup sequences. No pages of system initializations. Just basic procedures that any pilot could follow. Check control surfaces. Verify fuel levels. Test communications. Confirm navigation systems. It was almost suspiciously simple, as if the Ghost Hawk's designers had deliberately avoided unnecessary complexity. "Ghost Hawk to tower, requesting clearance for takeoff," Sarah said into the radio, her voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through her body. The response was immediate. "Ghost Hawk, you are cleared for takeoff. Good hunting, Captain." Good hunting. The phrase stirred something in Sarah's chest, a mix of pride and determination. She advanced the throttle, feeling the engine spool up with a low, throaty growl that vibrated through the airframe. The Ghost Hawk rolled forward, picking up speed smoothly, the rebuilt landing gear handling the rough patches in the tarmac without complaint. The acceleration was deceptive. The Ghost Hawk didn't feel particularly fast, didn't have the raw power of an FA-18 or the brutal thrust of an F-22. Instead, it built speed gradually, almost gently, the engines designed for efficiency and endurance rather than maximum performance. But Sarah could feel the power lurking beneath that gentle acceleration. The engines weren't straining or struggling. They were barely working, cruising along at a fraction of their potential output. This was an aircraft designed for long-range missions, capable of flying for hours at high altitude without refueling. The gentle acceleration was deliberate, conserving fuel and reducing wear on components. Sarah pulled back on the stick at exactly the right moment and felt the familiar lurch as the wheels left the ground. The plane climbed smoothly, cutting through the thin coastal clouds with ease. The controls were responsive but not twitchy, requiring subtle inputs rather than aggressive movements. It handled like an aircraft that had been designed for endurance missions rather than high-performance aerobatics. The Ghost Hawk climbed steadily, and Sarah noted with satisfaction that the aircraft felt solid, stable, well-balanced. There were none of the quirks or vices that characterized some experimental aircraft. The Ghost Hawk flew like it had been refined over years of operation, all the bugs worked out, all the systems optimized. Sarah ran through a series of basic maneuvers, rolls, banks, dives, testing the aircraft's responsiveness at different speeds and altitudes. The Ghost Hawk handled like a dream, the controls precise and intuitive, almost telepathic in their responsiveness. The aircraft seemed to anticipate her intentions, responding to the slightest pressure on the stick or rudder. The rolls were smooth and controlled, the aircraft rotating around its longitudinal axis with precision. The banks were equally smooth, with no tendency to over-rotate or oscillate. Even the dives were well behaved, the aircraft maintaining stability as it accelerated toward the ground, pulling out smoothly when Sarah applied back pressure to the stick. The flight characteristics were unusual. The Ghost Hawk didn't have the aggressive performance of a modern fighter, but it was remarkably stable, forgiving of pilot errors, easy to control even in challenging conditions. It felt more like flying a trainer than a combat aircraft, which Sarah realized was probably intentional. The easier the aircraft was to fly, the more cognitive resources the pilot could devote to managing the electronic warfare systems. Sarah had flown trainers early in her career, and she remembered how forgiving they had been. A trainer was designed to be difficult to crash, to give student pilots time to recover from mistakes, to build confidence and skill gradually. The Ghost Hawk had those same characteristics, but combined with performance capabilities that far exceeded any trainer. But it was when she activated the electronic warfare systems that the true nature of the aircraft revealed itself. A series of lights flickered to life on the instrument panel, and suddenly, Sarah's perception of the battlefield expanded exponentially. Her primary display transformed into a three-dimensional representation of the electromagnetic environment, showing radar signals from every ship and aircraft within 100 miles. Each signal was color-coded by threat level: green for civilian, yellow for military non-hostile, orange for potential threat, red for active threat. The transformation was stunning. One moment, Sarah had been flying by sight and basic instruments, relying on her own senses and conventional avionics. The next moment, she could see everything: every radar emission, every radio transmission, every electromagnetic signal in the environment. It was like suddenly gaining a new sense, a way of perceiving the world that humans normally couldn't access. She could see the commercial airliners following their designated flight paths, their transponders broadcasting position and altitude. She could monitor radio communications between air traffic control and civilian pilots, hear the routine exchanges that made modern aviation possible. She could track the movements of Navy vessels in the Atlantic, see their search radars sweeping the sky in predictable patterns. One commercial flight particularly caught Sarah's attention, a 737 flying from Miami to New York, currently at 35,000 feet and 150 miles to her west. On her display, she could see not just the aircraft's position, but also its transponder code, its communication frequency, even the specific model of radar altimeter it was using. The level of detail was extraordinary. But more than that, she could intercept encrypted transmissions, decode military communications, and track the movements of hostile forces in real time. It was like having a god's-eye view of the combat space, seeing everything, knowing everything, understanding the entire tactical situation at a glance. The amount of information was overwhelming at first. Sarah felt her TBI symptoms flaring, a headache beginning to build behind her eyes, a continue 441, a moment of disorientation as she tried to process all the data. The display seemed to pulse and shimmer, the colors blending together, the symbols and lines becoming impossible to distinguish from each other. She felt her grip tightening on the stick, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. But then the AI intervened, filtering the information, highlighting the most important details, suppressing the noise. The cognitive load dropped to manageable levels, and Sarah found she could actually make sense of the complex electromagnetic environment. The pulsing and shimmer faded. The display stabilized, showing clear, actionable information organized in a way that made intuitive sense. It was like having someone reach into her mind and organize her thoughts, taking the chaos and transforming it into order. The AI recognized that she was becoming overwhelmed and had automatically adjusted the information flow, reducing the amount of data being presented while ensuring that nothing critical was missed. "Chen, this is incredible," Sarah said over the secure channel, her voice filled with genuine awe. "I've never seen anything like this." "That's just the beginning," Chen replied, his voice crackling slightly through the encrypted link. "The X-47's real power is in its ability to deceive. Watch this." Chen walked her through activating the plane's signature manipulation systems. With a few keystrokes on the tactical display, the Ghost Hawk vanished from radar, its electronic profile replaced by the signature of a commercial airliner, a specific Boeing 737 that Sarah could see on her display, currently flying a route from Norfolk to Miami. Then it shifted again, becoming a civilian drone conducting survey operations, then a weather balloon drifting on atmospheric currents, then nothing at all, a void in the electromagnetic spectrum, a ghost in the machine. The transformation was seamless. Sarah watched on her displays as her own radar signature morphed from one profile to another. The system didn't just broadcast a different transponder code, it actively manipulated how radar waves interacted with the aircraft, creating false returns that matched the expected signature of whatever the Ghost Hawk was impersonating. "You can make enemy systems see whatever you want them to see," Chen explained, "or you can make them see nothing. It's the ultimate form of stealth. Not just hiding, but actively controlling the narrative of what the enemy perceives. You're not just invisible, you're whatever you choose to appear to be." Sarah felt a grin spreading across her face, the first genuine smile she had experienced in months. This was power, real power, the kind that didn't come from speed or weapons, but from information and control. It was the power to shape reality itself, to determine what was seen and what remained hidden, to write the story that others would believe. For the first time since the injury, she felt like herself again, not diminished or sidelined, but essential. Not a pilot struggling to compensate for limitations, but a warrior wielding a weapon that others couldn't even comprehend. She thought about all the months of doubt and self-recrimination, all the times she had questioned whether she was still capable, still valuable. And now, sitting in this cockpit with capabilities that seemed almost magical, she realized that she had been measuring herself against the wrong standard. She wasn't the same pilot she had been before the injury, but that didn't mean she was less. She was different, suited for a different kind of mission, but no less essential to the overall fight. She spent the next hour exploring the Ghost Hawk's capabilities. pushing the systems to their limits, learning the subtle art of electronic deception. She made herself appear as a squadron of fighters, then as a single helicopter, then as a flock of birds that just happened to be flying in perfect formation. She jammed radar systems and then unjammed them, watched as the enemy sensors struggled to make sense of the conflicting data. Creating the illusion of a fighter squadron was particularly interesting. Sarah programmed the electronic warfare system to generate multiple radar returns, each one corresponding to a different aircraft in a standard four-ship formation. The system automatically varied the spacing and altitudes to make the formation look realistic, even adding subtle variations in speed and heading to simulate individual pilots flying their own aircraft. On enemy radar screens, it would appear that a flight of 4 F/A-18s was approaching. Fighter controllers would calculate intercept courses, surface-to-air missile batteries would track the targets, commanders would make tactical decisions based on the perceived threat. All of them would be responding to phantoms, to electronic ghosts that existed only in their sensors and their minds. Chen guided her through increasingly complex scenarios, teaching her how to layer deceptions, how to create narratives that would seem plausible to enemy intelligence analysts. It wasn't enough to simply disappear or appear as something else. The deception had to make sense in context, had to fit into the enemy's expectations and understanding of the battle space. The key is consistency, Chen explained. If you appear as a commercial airliner, you need to follow commercial flight patterns, maintain appropriate altitude and speed, respond to air traffic control if they try to contact you. The moment something seems wrong, the moment the deception doesn't hold up to scrutiny, you've lost the advantage. He walked her through a scenario where the Ghost Hawk was impersonating a FedEx cargo flight. You need to think about every detail. What time of day would this flight normally operate? What altitude would it cruise at? What route would it follow? If air traffic control contacts you, how would a FedEx pilot respond? The deception has to be complete, encompassing every aspect of how that aircraft would behave. Sarah nodded, absorbing the lesson. This was a different kind of flying, one that required patience and subtlety rather than aggression and speed. It was chess, not boxing, a game of strategy and misdirection rather than direct confrontation. The comparison to chess resonated with Sarah. She had played chess as a child, had even competed in school tournaments. She remembered the thrill of setting up complex strategies, of sacrificing minor pieces to create winning positions, of thinking 3 or 4 moves ahead to anticipate her opponent's responses. The Ghost Hawk required the same mindset, not reacting to immediate threats, but shaping the entire engagement to ensure that when critical moments came, you had already positioned yourself for success. She landed the Ghost Hawk an hour later, her confidence restored, her sense of purpose renewed. As she climbed out of the cockpit, her legs slightly unsteady from the adrenaline come down, Chen was waiting with a satisfied smile. "How'd it feel?" he asked. "Like coming home," Sarah replied, and meant it. But even as she said the words, she knew the real test was still ahead. Flying the Ghost Hawk in controlled airspace was one thing. Impressive, certainly, but ultimately safe. Taking it into combat, where every decision mattered and every mistake could be fatal, where real enemies were trying to kill her, and the stakes were measured in human lives, that was something else entirely. That was what she had trained her entire life to do. And now, finally, she would have the chance to prove she could still do it. Sarah walked back toward the hangar, her mind already beginning to process everything she had learned. The Ghost Hawk wasn't just an aircraft, it was an entirely new way of thinking about aerial warfare. And if she could master it, if she could learn to wield its unique capabilities with the same skill she had once brought to conventional fighters, then maybe her career wasn't over. Maybe it was just beginning in a different direction. The opportunity came sooner than Sarah expected. 3 days after her first flight, Chen summoned her to a secure briefing room in the hangar. The walls were lined with monitors displaying real-time satellite imagery, and a large map of the Middle East dominated one wall. The map was covered with symbols and notations, showing the positions of friendly and hostile forces across the region. The briefing room had the sterile, utilitarian feel of a military command center. The walls were painted a neutral gray, and the floor was polished concrete. The map on the wall was a tactical display, updated in real time via satellite feeds, showing ship movements, aircraft positions, and known military installations across thousands of square miles of contested territory. Standing beside the map was a man Sarah didn't recognize. A Navy captain with the hard eyes of someone who had seen combat up close and the weathered face of someone who had spent years in harsh environments. His uniform was crisp but worn, the kind of wear that came from actual use rather than just time in storage. Captain Richard Garrett looked to be in his early 50s, with silver hair cut in a precise military style and a bearing that spoke of decades of service. His uniform displayed ribbons from multiple campaigns: Desert Storm, Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom. This was someone who had been in the thick of things, who had made life-and-death decisions under pressure, who had earned his rank through performance rather than just time and grade. "Captain Mitchell, this is Captain Richard Garrett," Chen said. "He's here to brief you on a situation that requires immediate attention." Garrett nodded curtly, his gaze assessing Sarah with the practiced eye of a commander evaluating a new asset. His eyes lingered on her for a moment, and Sarah wondered if he was thinking about her medical records, about the TBI, about whether she was really capable of handling what he was about to ask of her. "Captain, we have a developing crisis in the Red Sea. A civilian cargo vessel, the Meridian Star, has been seized by hostile forces. The ship is carrying humanitarian supplies destined for Yemen, but intelligence suggests the hostiles plan to use it as leverage in ongoing negotiations." He gestured to the map, pointing to a location off the Yemeni coast. A red icon marked the position of the Meridian Star, surrounded by several smaller icons representing hostile vessels. The vessel is currently anchored here, approximately 15 miles offshore. It's surrounded by several smaller vessels that our intelligence analysts believe are part of the hostile force. Gunboats, probably armed with heavy machine guns and RPGs. Sarah studied the map, noting the position of the Meridian Star and the tactical situation surrounding it. The area was far from any friendly bases, in waters that were effectively controlled by hostile forces. Any rescue operation would be extremely risky. "What's the plan?" "Officially, there is no plan," Garrett said, his tone making it clear he understood the implications of those words. "The State Department is working on a diplomatic solution, but that could take days or weeks. In the meantime, every hour the crew remains in hostile hands increases the risk. We've received intelligence suggesting the hostiles may be planning to move the prisoners to a land-based location, which would make rescue exponentially more difficult." He pulled up a satellite image showing the Meridian Star and the surrounding vessels. The image was remarkably detailed, shot from a reconnaissance satellite in low Earth orbit. Sarah could make out individual people on the decks of the vessels, could see the weapons mounted on the gunboats surrounding the cargo ship. The hostiles have air support, 6 Su-27 fighters operating out of a nearby airfield. Those fighters are patrolling the area in shifts, and they've made it clear through both actions and communications that any attempt to approach the cargo ship will be met with force. They shot down a reconnaissance drone yesterday, and they've buzzed our naval vessels multiple times. Garrett pulled up footage of one of the buzzing incidents. Sarah watched as 2 Su-27s made a low, high-speed pass over a U.S. destroyer, close enough that the fighter wake had rocked the ship. It was an aggressive move, a clear message that the hostile forces were willing to escalate if provoked. "You want me to neutralize the fighters," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. The mission parameters were becoming clear. "We want you to create a window of opportunity," Garrett corrected, his precise language suggesting he had given this briefing multiple times to multiple audiences. "A Navy SEAL team is standing by on the USS Baton, ready to board the Meridian Star and extract the crew. The SEALs can handle the gunboats and any resistance on the ship itself, but they can't move until the air threat is eliminated. The problem is, we can't send a strike package without escalating the situation into a full-scale conflict. That's where the Ghost Hawk comes in." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, adrenaline beginning to flow through her system. This was the kind of mission she had trained for her entire career. High stakes, complex objectives, and the need for precision under pressure. This was what she had joined the Navy to do. "What are my rules of engagement? You are authorized to use electronic warfare to neutralize the enemy fighters, but you are not authorized to engage with kinetic weapons unless fired upon first," Garrett said. "The goal is to make the fighters ineffective without creating an international incident. We need those planes out of the picture, but we can't have them falling out of the sky in flames with CNN cameras watching." Can the Ghost Hawk do that? Sarah thought about the training flights, about the capabilities Chen had shown her. The Ghost Hawk could jam communications, spoof tracking systems, create false targets. But could it neutralize 6 enemy fighters without firing a shot? That was a different level of challenge entirely. I can blind them, confuse them, make them think they're chasing targets that don't exist, Sarah said slowly, thinking through the possibilities. But 6 fighters is a lot to handle simultaneously, especially if they're coordinating with ground-based radar. They won't be coordinating for long, Chen interjected. He had been standing quietly in the corner, but now he stepped forward to join the conversation. The Ghost Hawk can target the ground-based radar installations first, either jamming them completely or feeding them false data. Once the fighters lose their ground support, they're operating on their own sensors, which makes them much more vulnerable to spoofing. Garrett nodded. The window for the SEAL operation is narrow, approximately 45 minutes from the time the fighters are neutralized. That's how long it will take for the hostiles to realize something is wrong and scramble additional air support. Can you keep 6 Su-27s occupied for 45 minutes without them realizing they're being deceived? Sarah felt the weight of the mission settling on her shoulders. 45 minutes didn't sound like much time, but in aerial combat, it was an eternity. And these weren't training scenarios or simulations. These were real enemy pilots who would be trying to kill her if they discovered the deception. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and people would die. The stakes were enormous. 23 crew members on the Meridian Star, all of them depending on her ability to keep enemy fighters away long enough for the SEALs to extract them. The SEAL team itself, who would be vulnerable during the boarding operation. And potentially the broader geopolitical situation. If the mission went wrong, if it escalated into open conflict, the consequences could be severe. But that was the job. That was what she had signed up for when she joined the Navy, what she had trained for at the academy, and in every flight since. The TBI had taken many things from her, but it hadn't taken her courage or her commitment to the mission. When do I leave? She asked. You'll launch at 2100 hours, Garrett said. That gives you 6 hours to prep and plan. Chen will brief you on the specific electromagnetic environment you'll be operating in. The baton is standing by with mid-air refueling if you need it, but the less contact you have with other assets, the better. This mission doesn't officially exist, Captain. If something goes wrong... I know the drill, Sarah interrupted. Plausible deniability. The Ghost Hawk doesn't officially exist, so neither does this mission. Garrett's expression softened slightly. For what it's worth, Captain, I've seen your record. Before the injury, you were one of the best pilots in the fleet. Chen tells me you still are, just in a different way. I believe him. Good luck out there. The words meant more to Sarah than Garrett probably realized. For months, she had been defined by her limitations, by what she could no longer do. To have a senior officer acknowledge her capabilities, to express confidence in her ability to complete a critical mission, was validating in a way that went beyond simple professional respect. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah studied satellite imagery of the target area, memorizing the positions of every ship, every radar installation, every potential threat. She reviewed the technical specifications of the Su-27 fighters, learning their capabilities, their weaknesses, their typical engagement patterns. The Su-27 flanker was a formidable aircraft. Designed by the Soviet Union in the 1980s, it remained one of the most capable air superiority fighters in the world. It was fast, maneuverable, and equipped with sophisticated radar and weapon systems. In a conventional dogfight, an Su-27 could hold its own against any Western fighter, including the F-15 and F-A-18. But the Ghost Hawk wasn't going to engage in a conventional dogfight. Sarah's mission was to exploit the Su-27's reliance on its sensors to turn the aircraft's sophisticated systems into vulnerabilities. Chen walked her through the electromagnetic environment, showing her the frequencies used by the hostile forces, the encryption methods they employed, the patterns in their communications. He taught her how to identify individual pilots by their communication styles, how to exploit the gaps in their coordination, how to turn their own systems against them. The key is to think like them, Chen explained, pointing to intercepts of enemy communications. The intercepts were fascinating. Real radio traffic from hostile pilots, translated and analyzed by intelligence specialists. Sarah could hear the pilots' voices, their accents, their casual banter mixed with professional communications. These pilots are good, well-trained, flying advanced aircraft, but they're operating in a paradigm where what you see is what's real. They trust their instruments because they've never had reason not to. That's your advantage. You can manipulate their reality, make them see what you want them to see. Chen pulled up psychological profiles of the hostile pilots, compiled from months of intelligence gathering. This pilot here, call sign Falcon 1, is aggressive, likes to lead with his radar active, tends to trust his instruments over visual confirmation. He's vulnerable to radar spoofing. This one, Falcon 3, is more cautious, prefers to hang back and wait for his wingman to make contact before committing. You can exploit that caution, make him hesitate at critical moments. Sarah absorbed the information, her mind already beginning to formulate strategies. She could create false targets, make the fighters chase ghosts while the SEALs conducted their operation. She could jam their communications, force them to operate independently rather than as a coordinated unit. She could spoof their missile guidance systems, make them waste ordnance on targets that didn't exist. But the real challenge would be maintaining the deception for 45 minutes. That meant anticipating how the enemy would respond, staying one step ahead, adapting when they adapted. It meant thinking 3 moves ahead. Just like Chen had said during their first conversation, Sarah created a detailed mission plan, mapping out the sequence of deceptions she would employ. First, she would target the ground-based radar installations, feeding them false data that would make the Ghost Hawk appear to be far from its actual position, if it appeared at all. Then she would begin creating phantom targets, starting with subtle false returns that would gradually draw the fighters away from the Meridian Star. The plan required precise timing. If she created the phantom targets too quickly, the enemy might realize something was wrong. If she moved too slowly, she might not draw the fighters far enough away before the SEALs needed to move. She would need to calibrate the deception carefully, making it seem natural, making the enemy believe they were responding to real threats rather than being manipulated. At 20:30 hours, Sarah suited up and made her way to the Ghost Hawk. The aircraft sat in the hangar, looking as decrepit as ever, its faded paint and patched repairs giving no hint of the sophisticated technology hidden beneath. The ground crew had fueled and prepped the plane, their movements efficient and professional despite the late hour. The pre-flight preparations had a ritualistic quality. The crew chief, Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, a different Rodriguez from the Ghost Hawk pilot Sarah would meet later, walked around the aircraft with her, checking every system, explaining the specific quirks of this particular airframe. "She's a good bird," Rodriguez said, patting the fuselage with obvious affection. "Treat her right and she'll bring you home." Chen met her at the aircraft, his expression serious. "Remember, Captain, the Ghost Hawk is more than just a tool. It's a partner. Trust the AI, let it handle the tactical details while you focus on the strategic picture. And if things go sideways, if the deception fails, you get out of there. No heroics. The mission isn't worth your life." Sarah nodded, but they both knew the words were perfunctory. If the deception failed, if the enemy fighters discovered her presence, the SEALs would be exposed and vulnerable. She couldn't just run away and leave them to die. That wasn't how the Navy worked. That wasn't who she was. The Navy had drilled into her, from her first days at the academy, that you never left people behind. You completed the mission. You protected your teammates. You accepted risk to yourself to minimize risk to others. Those weren't just words or abstract principles. They were the foundation of everything the military stood for. She climbed into the cockpit and began the pre-flight checklist, her hands moving over the controls with practiced precision. The familiar routine was calming, a reminder that she had done this hundreds of times before. The TBI might have changed some things, but it hadn't changed the fundamental skills that made her a pilot. The checklist took on an almost meditative quality. Each item confirmed, each system checked, each potential failure point verified as operational. By the time Sarah reached the end of the checklist, she felt centered, focused, ready. The nervousness that had been building throughout the day had transformed into a calm determination. At exactly 2100 hours, Sarah advanced the throttle, and the Ghost Hawk rolled out of the hangar. The night sky was clear, stars visible above the ambient light of the base. She took off smoothly, climbing to altitude, setting course for the Red Sea. The night was beautiful. From altitude, Sarah could see the lights of cities along the coast, ships moving across the dark ocean, aircraft following their designated flight paths. It looked peaceful, orderly, safe, but she was heading toward a situation where order had broken down, where violence threatened, where her actions in the next few hours would determine whether people lived or died. The flight took 2 hours, the Ghost Hawk cruising at a steady pace that conserved fuel while maintaining good speed. Sarah used the time to review the mission parameters one more time, to run through potential scenarios in her mind, to prepare herself mentally for what was coming. She thought about the crew of the Meridian Star, 23 people, sailors, engineers, cooks, radio operators. Most of them probably had families waiting at home, unaware that their loved ones were in danger. Some might have children who didn't understand why dad or mom wasn't answering their calls. They were depending on Sarah, trusting her with their lives even though they didn't know she existed. The weight of that responsibility was almost crushing. But Sarah forced herself to channel the anxiety into focus. These people needed her to be at her best, to execute flawlessly, to not let doubt or fear interfere with the mission. She took a deep breath, counted to 4, exhaled slowly. Dr. Chen's breathing techniques, put to practical use in a combat situation. As she approached the target area, she activated the electronic warfare suite. Her displays lit up with information, radar emissions, radio communications, the electronic signatures of ships and aircraft. She could see the Meridian Star clearly, a bright spot on her screen surrounded by smaller contacts that represented the hostile gunboats. And there, circling at 20,000 feet, were 6 contacts that could only be the Su-27 fighters. They were flying a standard combat air patrol pattern, 2 fighters at high altitude, 2 at medium altitude, 2 at low altitude. The pattern was designed to provide overlapping coverage, to ensure that no aircraft could approach the Meridian Star without being detected and engaged. The pattern was professional, well executed, exactly what Sarah would have expected from competent pilots flying a defensive mission. The high-altitude pair were positioned to detect threats early and direct the other fighters. The medium-altitude pair were positioned to intercept any approaching aircraft. The low-altitude pair were there to engage any low-flying threats, particularly helicopters or slow-moving attack aircraft. It was a good defensive setup. Against a conventional attack, it would have been highly effective, but against the Ghost Hawk it was about to become a liability. The very coordination and professionalism that made it effective would also make it vulnerable to the kind of systematic deception Sarah was about to employ. Sarah smiled grimly. They were about to discover that their sensors couldn't be trusted. She began with the ground-based radar installations, targeting the 2 primary sites that were providing guidance to the fighters. The Ghost Hawk systems identified the radar frequencies, analyzed the signal patterns, and then began feeding false data back to the installations. On the enemy screens, the sky would appear exactly as it had before. No new contacts, no threats, everything normal. The radar installations were using older Soviet-era technology, which made them easier to spoof than more modern systems might have been. Sarah's AI identified the specific model, a P-18 spoon rest early warning radar, and accessed its technical specifications from the database. The P-18 used a specific frequency range and pulse pattern, and it processed returns in a predictable way that could be exploited. Within seconds, the Ghost Hawk was feeding carefully crafted false returns back to the P-18 radar. The operators looking at their screens would see exactly what they expected to see: the 6 Su-27's on patrol, the Meridian Star and surrounding gunboats, a few distant contacts that were probably commercial shipping. Nothing to cause alarm. Nothing to suggest that an enemy aircraft was operating inside their defensive perimeter. But that normalcy was an illusion. Sarah was already inside their defensive perimeter, invisible to their sensors, a ghost in the machine. Next, she targeted the fighters' own radar systems. The Su-27 used a pulse Doppler radar system, sophisticated but ultimately predictable. Sarah's AI analyzed the radar emissions from each fighter, identified the specific parameters of each system, and then began spoofing returns. The fighters would see targets on their screens, aircraft that appeared to be approaching the Meridian Star, potential threats that needed to be investigated. Sarah watched as the enemy formation began to break apart. 2 fighters peeled off to investigate a phantom contact to the north, an aircraft that appeared to be a P-3 Orion maritime patrol plane, flying at low altitude, heading toward the Meridian Star. It was exactly the kind of threat the fighters had been positioned to intercept, and they responded immediately, turning to engage. 2 more turned to intercept a false target to the east. This one appeared to be a pair of helicopters, probably carrying a boarding team, approaching from the direction of the nearest U.S. naval vessel. Again, the hostile fighters responded as trained, moving to intercept what they believed was an immediate threat. The remaining 2 held their position, but their attention was divided, their sensors showing multiple potential threats that didn't fit any obvious pattern. Sarah could hear the confusion in their communications as they reported contacts to their ground controllers, requesting guidance on which threats to prioritize. Ghost Hawk to Baton, the path is clear, Sarah transmitted on the secure channel. You have your window. Roger that, Ghost Hawk. SEALs are launching now. We'll need 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Sarah checked her fuel levels and her position. She had more than enough fuel to maintain the deception for that long, assuming nothing went wrong, but she couldn't afford to make any mistakes. If even one of those fighters discovered what was really happening, if they realized the targets they were chasing didn't exist, the entire mission would collapse. She monitored the fighters closely, watching as they investigated the phantom contacts. The pilots were professional, following standard intercept procedures, trying to get visual confirmation of the targets their radar was showing them. But when they arrived at the projected intercept points, they found nothing but empty sky. The northern pair reached the location where the P-3 should have been, but found only open ocean and darkness. Falcon 1 to control, Sarah heard over the intercepted communications. Negative contact on Bogey 1. Our radar showed a contact, but there's nothing here. Could have been a flock of birds or atmospheric ducting. Atmospheric ducting, the phenomenon where radar waves bounce off layers of air at different temperatures, creating false returns. It was a plausible explanation, one that the pilot's training would have taught him to consider. Sarah had counted on that, had designed her deception to exploit the pilot's own knowledge and experience. Sarah heard the confusion in their communications as they reported back to their ground controllers. The controllers, seeing the same false data on their screens, ordered the fighters to expand their search patterns to find the mysterious aircraft that kept appearing and disappearing. The ground controller's voice came through clearly on the intercepted frequency. Falcon Flight, be advised we're tracking multiple intermittent contacts in your sector. Possible stealth aircraft or jamming. Expand search pattern and maintain alert. Perfect. The enemy was drawing exactly the conclusion Sarah wanted them to draw, that there were multiple threats in the area, requiring their full attention and their dispersion across a wide area. They weren't yet suspicious that the threats themselves might be fabricated. And all the while, the SEALs were moving closer to the Meridian Star, their small assault boats invisible to radar, approaching under cover of darkness. Sarah could track their progress on her display, watching as they closed the distance to the cargo ship at a steady pace. 20 miles out, 15 miles, 10. Sarah created new targets, leading the fighters on a wild chase across hundreds of square miles of airspace. She made them see an entire strike package. Bombers escorted by fighters, heading toward critical infrastructure inland. The ghost bombers appeared on radar as B-1B Lancers, flying in a standard penetration formation, heading toward what looked like a major military installation 200 miles inland. This was a threat the enemy commanders couldn't ignore. B-1Bs carried enormous payloads and could strike deep into defended territory. If enemy bombers were approaching critical infrastructure, every available asset would need to respond. The enemy commanders, seeing what appeared to be a major attack developing, ordered all 6 fighters to intercept. Sarah listened as the radio traffic intensified, the professional calm giving way to urgency. All Falcon units, Vector 045, Angels 25. High priority intercept, weapons free on positive identification. The X-47's formed up and headed inland, chasing phantoms, leaving the Meridian Star completely undefended from the air. Baton, you've got clear skies, Sarah transmitted. All hostiles have been drawn off. You're good to go. Roger, Ghost Hawk. SEALs are boarding now. Sarah maintained the deception, keeping the enemy fighters occupied while the SEALs executed their mission. She heard snatches of communication from the assault team, brief professional updates as they moved through the Meridian Star, securing the crew, neutralizing the hostiles on the ship. Alpha Team, building 2 secure. 4 hostiles neutralized, no friendly casualties. Bravo Team has the crew, 23 souls, all accounted for. 2 injured, not critical. Charlie Team securing perimeter, gunboats holding position but showing no signs of hostile action. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. Sarah found herself hyper-aware of every detail, the fuel gauge ticking down, the enemy fighters searching for targets that didn't exist, the tactical situation constantly evolving. The TBI made it harder to process all the information simultaneously, but the Ghost Hawk's AI compensated, highlighting the critical details, filtering out the noise. She felt the familiar pressure building behind her eyes, the beginning of a headache that threatened to interfere with her concentration. But she pushed it aside, focused on the mission, relied on the AI to help manage the cognitive load. This was exactly the kind of situation where the Ghost Hawk's design philosophy proved its worth, the AI handling the tactical details, while Sarah focused on the strategic picture. 20 minutes into the operation, one of the enemy pilots began to express doubt. Sarah heard it in his voice over the intercepted communications, a note of suspicion, a question about why they hadn't achieved visual contact with any of the supposed targets. Falcon 3 to Falcon 1, the voice came through clearly. I'm not seeing anything on FLIR or visual. We should have had contact by now if these bogies are really out here. Something doesn't feel right. This was dangerous. If doubt spread through the enemy formation, if they began to question whether the threats were real, they might break off the pursuit and return to the Meridian Star. Sarah needed to reinforce the deception, to give them something concrete that would overcome their skepticism. She immediately adapted, creating a new deception. She made one of the Phantom aircraft appear to take evasive action, performing maneuvers that suggested it had spotted the pursuing fighters. The Ghost Bomber executed a hard turn, appearing to dive for the deck, broadcasting electronic signatures consistent with an aircraft taking defensive measures. The enemy pilot's doubt turned to aggression. He had found his prey, and now he was hunting it. Falcon 3 has contact, bogey maneuvering defensively, going to guns range for positive ID. Perfect. Sarah had transformed doubt into certainty, had given the pilot exactly what he needed to believe the threat was real. She led him on a chase that took him even further from the Meridian Star, making the Phantom aircraft seem to flee toward international airspace, performing evasive maneuvers that looked realistic, broadcasting distress calls that suggested a crew in panic. The pilot followed, convinced he was about to score a kill, unaware that he was chasing nothing but electromagnetic ghosts. Sarah could hear the excitement in his voice as he called out ranges and closure rates, convinced he was moments away from engaging an enemy bomber. 25 minutes. The SEALs reported that they had secured all hostages and neutralized the hostile forces on the Meridian Star. They were preparing to withdraw, moving the crew onto the assault boats, preparing to extract back to the Baton. Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The mission was succeeding. The fighters were still chasing Phantoms miles away from the actual operation. The SEALs had the crew and were preparing to withdraw. Just a few more minutes and they would be clear. But then Sarah saw a new contact appear on her display. A 7th fighter, scrambling from the nearby airfield. This one hadn't been part of the original patrol, hadn't been deceived by her earlier manipulations, and it was heading straight for the Meridian Star. Sarah's heart sank. This was the contingency she had hoped wouldn't happen. A fresh enemy asset, not yet caught up in the web of deception she had spun, heading directly for the area where the SEALs were most vulnerable. Sarah's mind raced. She could try to spoof this new fighter, but it would take time to analyze its systems, to develop effective countermeasures. Time she didn't have. The fighter would reach the cargo ship in less than 5 minutes, and once it arrived, it would see the SEALs' boats, would realize what was happening, would call for reinforcements and potentially open fire on the extraction team. She had 2 choices: let the fighter reach the Meridian Star and compromise the mission, or do something to stop it. But the Ghost Hawk had no weapons, no way to engage the fighter directly, unless she used herself as bait. The decision crystallized in Sarah's mind with perfect clarity. This was what she had been trained for, not the specific tactical situation, but the fundamental principle of accepting risk to protect others. The SEALs were vulnerable, exposed, depending on her to keep threats away from them. She couldn't let them down. Sarah turned the Ghost Hawk toward the approaching fighter, deliberately making her electronic signature visible. Continue 4:53 p.m. She broadcast on multiple frequencies, made her radar cross-section larger, essentially painted a target on herself. The Su-27's radar would paint her as a target. Not a Phantom this time, but a real aircraft, a genuine threat. The fighter immediately altered course, turning to intercept. Sarah could hear the pilot's excitement in his communications. He had found a real target, not another ghost. He was going to engage. Falcon 7 has radar contact, unknown aircraft, bearing 270, range 40 kilometers, moving to intercept and identify. Sarah waited until the fighter was committed to the intercept, until it was too far from the Meridian Star to turn back in time. She monitored the closure rate, calculated intercept times, waited for exactly the right moment. The Su-27 was approaching at over 600 knots, closing the range rapidly. 30 kilometers, 20, 15. Then she activated every countermeasure system the Ghost Hawk possessed, overwhelming the X-47's sensors with electromagnetic noise. It was the electronic warfare equivalent of a flashbang grenade, a massive, overwhelming burst of jamming across every frequency the fighter's systems used. The fighter's radar screen went blank. Its communications were jammed. Its navigation systems began giving false readings, showing the aircraft in a completely different location than it actually was. The pilot was suddenly flying blind, unable to see, unable to communicate, unable to orient himself. Even his backup instruments were showing conflicting information, the magnetic compass spinning wildly as Sarah's systems created powerful electromagnetic fields that disrupted its operation. Sarah maintained the jamming for 30 seconds, just long enough for the SEALs to complete their withdrawal from the Meridian Star. She could hear panicked communications from the Su-27 pilot, or rather, she could hear him trying to communicate, his transmissions cut off by her jamming before they reached his controllers. Then she disengaged, allowing the Su-27 systems to reset. The pilot would need time to reorient himself, to figure out where he was, to re-establish contact with his controllers. By the time he managed that, the SEALs would be gone, the mission complete. By the time the fighter's pilot regained control and re-established contact with his ground controllers, the SEALs were gone. The Meridian Star was still anchored in place, but its former captors were in custody and the crew was safe aboard the Baton, speeding away from the area at flank speed. The mission was complete. Sarah turned the Ghost Hawk toward home, her body trembling with adrenaline come down. Her hands were shaking slightly on the controls, and she could feel the headache that had been building finally breaking through, sending waves of pain through her skull. But she had done it. She had neutralized 6 enemy fighters, 7, counting the late arrival, without firing a single shot, without creating an international incident, without even being detected. She had proven that she was still capable, still valuable, still a warrior despite the injury that had tried to take that identity away from her. "Ghost Hawk, this is Baton." A voice crackled over the secure channel. "All personnel are safe and accounted for. Mission successful. Outstanding work, Captain." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Thank you, Baton." Ghost Hawk returning to base. The flight home took 3 hours, giving Sarah plenty of time to process what had just happened. She had flown a mission that would never appear in any official record, had saved 23 lives that would never know she existed, had demonstrated capabilities that could never be publicly acknowledged, and she had done it all while managing the symptoms of her TBI, while working within limitations that would have grounded her from conventional fighters. The Ghost Hawk had allowed her to turn those limitations into strengths, to fly a different kind of mission that required different skills. As she flew through the darkness, the stars bright above and the ocean dark below, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not because the mission was over, not because she had proven herself, but because she finally understood something fundamental. The TBI hadn't taken away her ability to be a pilot. It had simply changed the kind of pilot she was. She would never again be the aggressive, high-speed fighter jock she had been before the injury. But she didn't need to be. The Ghost Hawk required something different: patience, strategy, the ability to think rather than just react. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly the kind of pilot the world needed more of. Sarah thought about her father, about the lessons he had tried to teach her. He had always emphasized that being a warrior wasn't about fitting a specific mold or meeting someone else's expectations. It was about finding where you could serve most effectively, where your unique combination of skills and experiences could make the greatest difference. She had finally found that place. Not in the cockpit of an FA-18, not in conventional air combat, but here, in this ugly, faded aircraft that nobody took seriously until it was too late. This was where she belonged. Sarah landed at Oceana 3 hours later, the Ghost Hawk touching down smoothly on the same runway she had departed from. The touchdown was perfect, gentle, controlled, exactly on the designated spot. It was the kind of landing that would have been unremarkable in her old life, but felt like a small victory now, a confirmation that she still had the skills that mattered. As she taxied toward Hangar 7, she could see Chen waiting outside, along with Captain Garrett and several other officers she didn't recognize. One of them was a rear admiral, the stars on his collar visible even from a distance. Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness. Flag officers didn't show up for routine mission debriefs. She shut down the systems and climbed out of the cockpit, her legs unsteady after the long flight. The adrenaline had worn off completely now, leaving her exhausted, her head pounding, her body feeling like she had run a marathon. But she stood straight, maintaining military bearing despite the fatigue. Chen approached with a broad smile, extending his hand. "That was some of the finest flying I've ever seen," he said. 7 enemy fighters neutralized without a shot fired. The SEALs are already debriefing, and they can't stop talking about the precision of the operation. Garrett stepped forward, his stern expression softening slightly. "Captain Mitchell, on behalf of the United States Navy and the men you brought home safely tonight, thank you. What you did out there, that's going to be studied at the War College for years to come." The Rear Admiral stepped forward, and Sarah came to attention, saluting crisply. "At ease, Captain," he said, returning the salute. "I'm Rear Admiral James Hawthorne, and I oversee the Ghost Hawk program among other specialized assets. What you accomplished tonight was extraordinary." He gestured toward the hangar. "Walk with me." Sarah fell into step beside the Admiral as they walked away from the group, heading toward the far end of the flight line where they could speak privately. The Admiral moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command, but there was nothing pompous or self-important about him. He seemed genuinely interested in what Sarah had to say. "I've been following your career, Captain," Hawthorne said. "Even before the injury, you were one of our best. But what impressed me most wasn't your performance before the TBI. It was how you responded afterward. You didn't give up. You didn't accept being sidelined. You looked for a way to continue serving, even when that meant accepting an assignment that probably felt like a punishment." Sarah wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she remained silent, waiting for the Admiral to continue. "The Ghost Hawk program is expanding," Hawthorne said. "What started as an experiment, a proof of concept, has proven its value beyond anyone's expectations. Tonight's mission is just the latest example. We're going to build more aircraft, recruit more pilots, integrate the Ghost Hawks into our standard operational planning." He stopped walking and turned to face Sarah directly. "And we need leaders for this expansion. People who understand not just the technology, but the philosophy behind it. People who can train the next generation of Ghost Hawk pilots, who can help us refine our tactics and strategies, who can advocate for this program when there are people in the Pentagon who still think we should focus on conventional solutions." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Sir, are you offering me a command position?" "I'm offering you a chance to shape the future of aerial warfare," Hawthorne said. "The Ghost Hawk program needs a commander, someone who can oversee training, operations, and strategic planning. Someone who understands that modern combat isn't just about firepower and speed, but about information and deception. I think you're that person, Captain. Or rather, Major." "Major?" Sarah echoed, not sure she had heard correctly. "Your promotion came through this afternoon," Hawthorne said. "Congratulations. You've earned it, not just through tonight's mission, but through everything you've done since joining the program. And with the promotion comes the offer I just mentioned, command of the Ghost Hawk program, with responsibility for expanding it from 4 aircraft and 4 pilots to 20 aircraft and a full squadron of pilots." The offer was almost overwhelming. 6 months ago, Sarah had been facing the end of her career, being shuffled into a dead-end assignment to evaluate obsolete aircraft. Now she was being offered command of one of the most innovative programs in the Navy, with responsibility for shaping its future development. I don't know what to say, sir," Sarah managed. "Say yes," Hawthorne replied with a slight smile. "Or take some time to think about it. This is a big decision, and I don't expect you to make it instantly. But understand this. What you've proven tonight, what the Ghost Hawk program represents, it's going to change how we think about air combat. And you have a chance to be at the center of that change." He paused, then added, "I know about the TBI, Captain. I know about the doubts you faced, the questions about whether you're still capable. But what you did tonight puts all of that to rest. You're not just capable, you're exactly what this program needs. Your experience, your adaptability, your understanding of what it means to be underestimated, those aren't weaknesses. They're your greatest strengths for this mission." The words echoed what Chen had told her weeks ago, but coming from a flag officer, they carried a different weight. This wasn't just reassurance, it was official recognition that her path, different though it might be from what she had originally envisioned, was valid and valuable. "I'd be honored to accept, sir," Sarah said. "Thank you for this opportunity." Hawthorne extended his hand and Sarah shook it firmly. "Welcome to command, Major Mitchell. Now go get some rest. You've earned it. We'll start talking about the details tomorrow." Sarah returned to her quarters in a daze, her mind still processing everything that had happened. She had flown a combat mission, saved 23 lives, been promoted to major, and offered command of an entire program, all in the space of a few hours. It felt surreal, like something that was happening to someone else. She sat on her bed and pulled out her phone, scrolling through messages. There were several from her sister, asking how she was doing, wondering if Sarah was okay, expressing concern that they hadn't talked in a while. Sarah felt a pang of guilt. She had been so focused on her own struggles, so absorbed in her career crisis, that she had neglected the personal relationships that mattered. She called her sister. "Sarah, oh my God, I've been worried about you," Emily answered on the second ring. "You haven't returned my calls in weeks. Are you okay?" "I'm okay," Sarah said, and realized she meant it. For the first time in months, she could say those words and believe them. "Actually, I'm better than okay. I got promoted today. To major. That's amazing." Emily's excitement came through clearly. After the injury, you said things weren't going well. What changed?" Sarah thought about how to answer that. She couldn't tell her sister about the ghost hawk, couldn't explain the classified mission she had just flown, but she could tell her about the broader truth. "I realized I was measuring myself against the wrong standard," Sarah said. "I was trying to be the person I was before the injury, and I couldn't do it. But I found a different path, a different way to serve, and it turns out that's exactly what I needed." They talked for an hour, Sarah sharing as much as she could about her new assignment, leaving out all the classified details. Emily updating her on family news and her own life. By the time they hung up, Sarah felt more connected, more grounded than she had in months. She looked at the photograph of her father on the wall. "I found my place, Dad," she said softly. "It wasn't where I expected, but I think you'd be proud." The next morning, Sarah reported to Admiral Hawthorne's temporary office on base for her first command briefing. The office was functional rather than luxurious, a standard military workspace with a desk, some chairs, and walls covered with maps and organizational charts. Hawthorne was already there, along with Chen and several other officers Sarah didn't recognize. "Morning, Major," Hawthorne said. "Let's talk about building a squadron." The briefing lasted 3 hours. Sarah learned that the Ghost Hawk program had been operating on a shoestring budget with minimal personnel, proving the concept before committing major resources. But after a series of successful missions, culminating in last night's operation, the Pentagon had authorized a major expansion. 20 new Ghost Hawks would be built over the next 2 years. Sarah would be responsible for selecting and training the pilots, developing standard operating procedures, integrating the aircraft into existing command structures, and generally transforming what had been an experimental program into a fully operational squadron. "The challenge," Hawthorne explained, "is finding the right pilots. We can't just take the top performers from flight school. The Ghost Hawk requires a different mindset, different skills. We need people who can think strategically, who can be patient, who can resist the temptation to rely purely on instinct. People who have had to adapt," Sarah said, understanding. "People who have faced challenges that force them to develop new approaches." "Exactly," Hawthorne confirmed. "We're looking for pilots who might not be perfect fits for conventional fighters, but who have the mental flexibility and strategic thinking the Ghost Hawk requires. People like you." One of the other officers, a colonel from Air Force Special Operations, spoke up. "We've compiled a list of potential candidates. Some have medical issues that have limited their conventional flying careers. Others have psychological profiles that suggest they'd excel at the kind of patience and strategic thinking the Ghost Hawk requires. We need you to review the list and help us identify the best candidates." Sarah spent the rest of the day reviewing personnel files. The candidates were a diverse group, each with their own story, their own reasons for being considered for the Ghost Hawk program. There was Lieutenant Marcus Reed, who had washed out of fighter training due to vision problems that made it difficult for him to track targets at long range. There was Captain Michael Foster, who had developed a heart condition that prevented him from pulling high-G maneuvers. There was Lieutenant Commander Jennifer Chang, who had developed severe anxiety after a crash that killed her co-pilot. Each file told a story of someone who had faced adversity, who had been told they couldn't do something, who had been forced to adapt and find new paths. These were people who understood what it meant to be underestimated, who knew how to turn limitations into strengths. Sarah began making notes, identifying the candidates who seemed like the best fits. She looked for people who had demonstrated resilience, who had continued to serve despite setbacks, who had shown the kind of strategic thinking and patience that the Ghost Hawk required. Over the next few weeks, Sarah threw herself into building the squadron. She interviewed potential pilots, designed training programs, worked with Chen and the technical team to refine the Ghost Hawk systems based on lessons learned from recent missions. The first pilot she recruited was Lieutenant Reed. When she called him into her office to discuss the opportunity, he looked skeptical. "Ma'am, I appreciate the consideration, but I've been told I'm not fit for combat flying," Reed said. "My vision issues—" "Your vision issues make you unsuitable for conventional fighters," Sarah interrupted. "But the Ghost Hawk isn't a conventional fighter. It operates in the electromagnetic spectrum as much as the visual spectrum. And from your file, I see that you have exceptional aptitude for systems management and strategic thinking. Those are the skills we need." She pulled up footage from her mission over the Red Sea, showing, with appropriate redactions, how the Ghost Hawk operated. "This aircraft doesn't require you to visually track targets at long range. It requires you to think 3 moves ahead, to manage complex electronic warfare systems, to be patient and strategic. Can you do that?" Reed watched the footage with growing interest. "Yes, ma'am, I believe I can." "Then welcome to the Ghost Hawk program." She recruited Foster next, then Chang, then others from her list. Each conversation followed a similar pattern: initial skepticism, followed by growing excitement as they understood what the Ghost Hawk represented, what kind of flying it required. Within 3 months, Sarah had assembled a core team of 6 pilots, each bringing unique strengths and perspectives. They began training together, learning the Ghost Hawk systems, developing tactics and procedures, building the culture that would define the squadron. Sarah discovered that she loved teaching, loved mentoring, loved watching pilots have the same revelation she had experienced, that their perceived limitations were actually qualifications for this unique mission. Captain Michael Foster had been a promising fighter pilot before his heart condition forced him out of high-performance aircraft. He could no longer pull 8G turns or engage in aggressive dogfighting. But in the Ghost Hawk, where the focus was on strategic thinking rather than physical performance, he excelled. His medical background, he had studied pre-med before joining the military, gave him insights into how stress affected decision-making, which proved valuable in developing training protocols. Lieutenant Commander Jennifer Chang brought a different set of strengths. Her anxiety, which had been seen as a disqualifying factor for conventional fighters, made her hyper-vigilant in the Ghost Hawk. She noticed details that others missed, identified potential threats earlier, maintained situational awareness even in complex electromagnetic environments. She learned to channel her anxiety into focused attention, rather than letting it become paralyzing fear. The training program Sarah developed was unlike anything in conventional flight schools. Rather than focusing on aerobatic maneuvers and aggressive tactics, Ghost Hawk training emphasized patience, observation, and strategic thinking. Pilots spent as much time in classroom discussions as they did in the cockpit, learning game theory, psychology, electronic warfare principles, and the art of deception. One training exercise particularly exemplified the Ghost Hawk philosophy. Sarah had her pilots operate in a simulated environment where they were outnumbered 5-1 by enemy fighters. The conventional approach would be to engage aggressively, trying to defeat the enemy through superior tactics and firepower. But the Ghost Hawk approach was different. "Your mission isn't to defeat the enemy fighters," Sarah explained. "It's to make them irrelevant, make them chase phantoms, make them waste fuel and ammunition on targets that don't exist, make them so confused about what's happening that they can't effectively respond to the actual threat." Lieutenant Reed executed the exercise perfectly. Rather than engaging the enemy fighters directly, he created a web of deceptions that had them chasing false targets across hundreds of miles of airspace. By the time they realized they had been fooled, the actual mission, a simulated strike on a high-value target, had been completed successfully. "That's exactly right," Sarah told him after the exercise. "You won without fighting. You achieved the mission objective without ever being detected, without ever being in danger, without ever firing a shot. That's the Ghost Hawk philosophy." 6 months after taking command, Sarah stood in Hangar 7 watching her squadron prepare for a major exercise. What had once been a single isolated hangar now housed 4 Ghost Hawks, with plans for more as production ramped up. The hangar had been expanded, new facilities added, the entire operation growing to accommodate the program's success. Her pilots moved around the aircraft with growing confidence, performing pre-flight checks, discussing tactics, supporting each other. They had become a team, bound together by their shared experience of being underestimated and then proving everyone wrong. Chen walked over to join her. "You've built something special here, Major. This squadron, it's not just about the aircraft or the technology. It's about the people, the culture, the understanding that there are many ways to be a warrior." Sarah nodded. "That's what my father tried to teach me. It just took me a while to understand what he meant." She thought about how far she had come in less than a year, from being sidelined and dismissed, facing what she thought was the end of her career, to commanding one of the most innovative programs in the Navy, from seeing herself as broken to understanding that she was simply different, that her experiences and adaptations made her valuable in ways she had never imagined. The Ghost Hawk had taught her that power didn't always look powerful, that effectiveness didn't always look impressive, that sometimes the most important victories were the ones nobody ever heard about. And most importantly, it had taught her that being underestimated wasn't a weakness. It was a weapon, one she had learned to wield with precision and skill. Admiral Hawthorne visited regularly to check on the squadron's progress. During one visit, he pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "You've exceeded every expectation, Major," he said. "The squadron is ahead of schedule in its development. Your pilots are performing at levels that surprised even me, and the mission success rate is perfect. But I want to talk about the next phase." "Next phase, sir?" "Integration with conventional forces," Hawthorne explained. "Right now, the Ghost Hawks operate independently, flying specialized missions. But the real power of this capability comes from integrating it with conventional strike packages, with special operations, with the full spectrum of military operations. We need to develop doctrine for how Ghost Hawks support and enable other forces." Sarah had been thinking about this same issue. "The Ghost Hawk is a force multiplier," she said. "A single aircraft can make an entire strike package more effective by providing intelligence, creating diversions, jamming enemy defenses. But we need to train conventional forces on how to work with us, how to take advantage of the opportunities we create." "Exactly," Hawthorne confirmed. "I want you to develop a training program for integrating Ghost Hawk operations with conventional forces, work with fighter squadrons, special operations teams, naval surface warfare groups. Show them what we can do. Teach them how to exploit the capabilities we provide." The integration training proved challenging. Conventional forces were initially skeptical of the Ghost Hawks, dismissing them as interesting curiosities but not essential to core missions. Sarah had to overcome the same skepticism she had faced personally, but at an organizational level. She started by arranging demonstration exercises. In one exercise, a conventional fighter squadron was tasked with penetrating a sophisticated air defense network. Without Ghost Hawk support, the mission would have required extensive preparatory strikes, significant risk, and likely some losses. But with a Ghost Hawk operating ahead of the strike package, the entire dynamic changed. Sarah flew the Ghost Hawk herself, infiltrating the enemy air defense network, mapping its coverage and weaknesses, identifying gaps that could be exploited. Then, as the strike package approached, she systematically jammed and spoofed the defensive radars, creating corridors through which the fighters could penetrate without being detected. The strike was completed without a single enemy engagement, without any losses, without the defenders even realizing they had been penetrated until after the attack was complete. "That's incredible," the strike package commander said during the debrief. "We would have lost at least 2 aircraft on that mission without your support, maybe more, and the defenses would have been alerted, making follow-up strikes much more difficult." "That's the Ghost Hawk advantage," Sarah explained. "We don't defeat the enemy through firepower. We defeat them through information and deception, making their defenses useless without them realizing it until it's too late." Word of the demonstration spread. Other squadrons requested Ghost Hawk support for their training exercises. Special operations teams wanted to learn how to coordinate with Ghost Hawks during raids and extractions. The Navy's surface warfare community wanted to understand how Ghost Hawks could support anti-surface operations. Sarah and her squadron suddenly found themselves in high demand, their capabilities sought after by units across the military. The skepticism that had initially greeted the program transformed into enthusiastic acceptance as more people saw what the Ghost Hawks could do. 1 year after taking command, Sarah stood on the flight line at Oceana, watching the sun set over the Atlantic. 4 Ghost Hawks were lined up on the tarmac, no longer hidden away in a single isolated hangar, but integrated into the squadron's regular operations. Construction was underway on expanded facilities to accommodate the additional aircraft that would arrive over the coming year. She had her team now, 6 pilots, each with their own story, their own reasons for being here. There was Reed, the lieutenant with vision problems who had become an expert at operating in degraded visual conditions, who could navigate and fight using only electronic sensors with a precision that astonished his instructors. There was Rodriguez, the Marine who had lost most of his hearing but had developed an almost supernatural ability to read electronic signatures, who could identify specific enemy radar systems by subtle characteristics in their emissions that others couldn't detect. There was Chang, who had transformed her anxiety into hypervigilance, spotting threats that others missed, maintaining situational awareness across complex battle spaces that would have overwhelmed most pilots. There was Foster, whose medical condition had ended his fighter career but had led him to the Ghost Hawk, where his strategic thinking and understanding of human physiology under stress made him an exceptional mission planner. And there were 2 others who had joined more recently. Captain Lisa Torres, who had developed chronic vertigo after an ejection that made her unsuitable for high-performance maneuvering, but who had found a home in the Ghost Hawk's more measured operational environment, and Major James Wilson, who had PTSD from a mission gone wrong and found that the Ghost Hawk's AI-assisted operations reduced his cognitive load enough that he could function effectively. They were the island of misfit toys, as Rodriguez jokingly called them, but they were also the future of aerial warfare, pilots who understood that modern combat wasn't about brute force, but about information, deception, and strategic thinking. Sarah's personal life had stabilized too. She had started seeing a therapist who specialized in traumatic brain injuries, learning better coping strategies for her symptoms. The headaches still came, but less frequently and with less intensity. The vertigo still struck occasionally, but she had learned to recognize the warning signs and manage the symptoms before they became debilitating. She had reconnected with her sister, rebuilding their relationship, making time for regular calls and occasional visits despite her busy schedule. She had even started dating an aerospace engineer named David who worked for one of the defense contractors supporting the Ghost Hawk program. He thought the aircraft's design philosophy was brilliant and didn't see her TBI as a deficiency, but simply as part of who she was. David had been surprisingly understanding about the limitations the TBI imposed. When Sarah had to cancel a date because a headache made it impossible to drive, he had come to her place with takeout and aspirin, happy to spend a quiet evening together watching movies. When she occasionally struggled to find words or lost her train of thought, another lingering effect of the injury, he waited patiently, rather than finishing her sentences or showing impatience. "You know what I find interesting?" David had said during one of their conversations. "The Ghost Hawk's design philosophy mirrors your own adaptation to the TBI. Both involve finding alternative paths to achieve objectives, using strengths to compensate for limitations, operating in ways that others don't expect." Sarah had never thought about it that way, but he was right. The Ghost Hawk and she had both learned to succeed by being different rather than by conforming to conventional expectations. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Chen approaching. He had become more than just a liaison. He was a friend, a mentor, someone who understood the unique challenges and opportunities of the Ghost Hawk program. He had been there from the beginning, had believed in her when she had struggled to believe in herself. "Beautiful evening," he said, coming to stand beside her. "Yeah," Sarah agreed. "It is." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as the last light faded from the sky. The Ghost Hawks looked almost noble in the twilight, their faded paint taking on a burnished quality that made them seem timeless rather than obsolete. In the fading light, you could almost forget how decrepit they looked in full daylight, could almost imagine them as the sophisticated weapons systems they truly were. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you'd turned down the assignment?" Chen asked. "If you'd refused to fly the Ghost Hawk?" Sarah considered the question. "Sometimes. But I think I would have been miserable. I would have kept trying to be the pilot I was before, kept fighting against my limitations instead of finding a role where they didn't matter. The Ghost Hawk gave me permission to be different, to embrace a new way of fighting." "It's funny," Chen mused. "We designed the Ghost Hawk to hide in plain sight, to be underestimated and overlooked. We never realized that the same philosophy would apply to the pilots who flew it. People see your medical records, your limitations, and they assume you're finished. They don't look deeper, don't see the strategic mind, the adaptability, the resilience that makes you perfect for this mission." Sarah smiled. "Just like they see a faded junker and don't realize it's one of the most advanced aircraft ever built." "Exactly," Chen said. Deception isn't just about technology. It's about psychology, about understanding how people see the world and then exploiting those perceptions. The Ghost Hawk does that with radar and sensors. You do it with people's expectations and assumptions. He paused, then added, "You've come a long way in a year, Major. From being sidelined to commanding a squadron that's changing how we think about aerial warfare. Your father would be proud." The words hit Sarah harder than she expected. She thought about her father often, imagined conversations with him, wondered what advice he would give. But hearing someone else say that he would be proud made it more real somehow, more meaningful. "Yeah," Sarah said quietly. "I think he would be." As darkness fell and the first stars became visible, Sarah thought about how much her life had changed in a single year. She had gone from being sidelined and dismissed to commanding one of the most innovative programs in the Navy. She had gone from seeing herself as broken to understanding that she was simply different, that her experiences and adaptations made her valuable in ways she had never imagined. The Ghost Hawk had taught her that power didn't always look powerful, that effectiveness didn't always look impressive, that sometimes the most important victories were the ones nobody ever heard about. And most importantly, it had taught her that being underestimated wasn't a weakness, it was a weapon, one she had learned to wield with precision and skill. Sarah turned to Chen. "Come on, we've got a briefing at 0600 and I want to go over the mission parameters one more time. We're integrating with that SEAL team next week, and I want to make sure we're prepared." "Always the perfectionist," Chen said with a smile. "Not perfectionist," Sarah corrected. "Just prepared. There's a difference." As they walked back toward the hangar, Sarah cast one last glance at the Ghost Hawks sitting on the flight line. In the darkness, they were barely visible, their faded paint making them blend into the shadows. But she knew the truth about them, just as she knew the truth about herself. Appearances could be deceiving. Limitations could become strengths. And sometimes the most dangerous weapon was the one nobody saw coming. The Ghost Hawks would continue to fly their secret missions, protecting people who would never know they existed, making the impossible possible through deception and strategic brilliance. And Sarah would continue to lead them, embracing her role as a warrior who won battles without firing a shot, who changed the world from the shadows. It wasn't the career she had imagined when she first joined the Navy, but it was the career she had earned, the mission she was perfectly suited for, the legacy she was proud to build. And that, Sarah realized as she walked into the hangar with Chen beside her, was more than enough. It was everything. The conference room at the Pentagon was filled with senior officers, defense officials, and military analysts. Sarah stood at the front of the room, a presentation displayed on the large screen behind her. She was now Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, having been promoted again 6 months earlier, and the Ghost Hawk program had grown beyond anything she had imagined. 20 Ghost Hawks were now operational, flying missions across the globe. The squadron had supported operations in the Pacific, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and Africa. Not a single Ghost Hawk had been detected by enemy forces. Not a single mission had failed due to the Ghost Hawks being unable to create the opportunities needed for conventional forces to succeed. The Ghost Hawk program has fundamentally changed how we think about air superiority, Sarah said, advancing to the next slide. Traditional air superiority focused on defeating enemy aircraft in combat, shooting them down, destroying them on the ground, establishing dominance through firepower. She clicked to a slide showing statistics from recent operations. The Ghost Hawk establishes air superiority through information dominance. We don't need to shoot down enemy aircraft if we can make them irrelevant, if we can control what they see and what they respond to, if we can render their entire defensive network useless without them realizing it. One of the generals in the audience raised his hand. "Colonel, this is impressive, but what happens when the enemy figures out what we're doing? When they develop countermeasures? The Ghost Hawk's advantage seems to be based on enemies not knowing what to look for." It was a good question, one Sarah had been expecting. "That's true, General. The Ghost Hawk's effectiveness depends partially on enemies not understanding our capabilities. But even if they know we're out there, even if they know to be suspicious of their own sensors, that knowledge itself becomes a weapon we can use against them." She advanced to another slide showing a hypothetical scenario. If the enemy knows their sensors might be compromised, if they know they can't trust their radar or their communications, that creates uncertainty. Uncertainty leads to hesitation. Hesitation leads to slower response times and less effective defense. Even if the enemy knows about the Ghost Hawk, even if they're actively looking for signs of electronic deception, They still have to operate in an environment where they can't be certain what's real and what isn't. Another officer spoke up. What about the pilots, Colonel? You've had remarkable success recruiting pilots who wouldn't normally be considered for combat operations. Is that sustainable? Can we continue to find pilots with the right combination of skills and temperament? Sarah smiled. General, we've received over 500 applications to the Ghost Hawk program in the last year alone. Pilots who have been told they're not suitable for conventional fighters, who have medical or psychological issues that have limited their careers. But they're not looking for an easy path. They're looking for a chance to serve, to use their unique skills and experiences in ways that conventional forces can't accommodate. She advanced to a slide showing graduation photos from the most recent Ghost Hawk training class. We just graduated our 3rd training cohort, 12 new pilots who will join the squadron over the next 6 months. Every one of them has a story similar to mine, has faced adversity and adapted, has learned that their perceived limitations are actually qualifications for this unique mission. The briefing continued for another hour, Sarah fielding questions, explaining the Ghost Hawk's Continue 5-09 PM capabilities, outlining plans for future expansion. By the end, even the skeptics in the audience seemed convinced that the program represented a genuine innovation in aerial warfare. As the meeting broke up, Admiral Hawthorne approached Sarah. Excellent briefing, Colonel. You've come a long way from that first flight in the Ghost Hawk. Thank you, sir. I had good teachers. Hawthorne smiled. And now you're the teacher, training the next generation. Speaking of which, I have a proposition for you. The Air Force wants to develop their own version of the Ghost Hawk, adapted for their specific needs. They want someone to help them set up their program, someone who understands not just the technology, but the philosophy. I recommended you. Sarah felt a mix of excitement and hesitation. Sir, I appreciate the recommendation, but I have responsibilities here. The squadron will be in good hands. Hawthorne interrupted. Major Rodriguez is ready to take command. He's learned everything you have to teach him, and he has the leadership skills to take the squadron to the next level. This is an opportunity to spread the Ghost Hawk philosophy to another service, to ensure that this approach to warfare becomes standard across the military, not just in the Navy. Sarah thought about it. She had built the Navy's Ghost Hawk program from almost nothing, had turned a skeptical experiment into a proven capability. The idea of doing it again, of helping the Air Force develop their own program, was appealing. But it also meant leaving behind the squadron she had built, the pilots she had trained, the place where she had found her purpose. Can I think about it, sir? Of course. Take your time, but don't take too long. The Air Force is eager to get started. That evening, Sarah sat in her quarters, reviewing the day's events. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. How did the Pentagon briefing go? She smiled and replied, Well, very well. Got offered a new assignment. Need to talk to you about it. Come over for dinner. We can discuss. Sarah arrived at David's apartment an hour later. He had prepared her favorite meal, grilled salmon with roasted vegetables, and they ate while Sarah explained the Air Force opportunity. It sounds like an incredible opportunity, David said, but you've built something special here. Leaving that behind would be difficult. I keep thinking about what my father used to say, Sarah replied. That being a warrior isn't about staying in your comfort zone. It's about going where you're needed most, where you can make the greatest difference. And where do you think you're needed most? Sarah considered the question. Maybe both places. Maybe I can help the Air Force get their program started, establish the foundation, and then return to the Navy. Or maybe this is the next phase of my career, spreading the Ghost Hawk philosophy beyond just one service. They talked late into the night, weighing options, considering possibilities. By the time Sarah left, she hadn't made a final decision, but she knew what direction she was leaning. A week later, Sarah called Admiral Hawthorne with her answer. I'll do it, sir. I'll help the Air Force set up their Ghost Hawk program. But on one condition, I maintain ties with the Navy program, serve as an advisor, help ensure that both services are developing in compatible directions. Done, Hawthorne said immediately. I'll make it happen. Congratulations, Colonel. You're about to shape the future of aerial warfare across all the services. Sarah spent the next month preparing for the transition. She worked with Rodriguez to ensure he was ready to take command, briefed him on ongoing operations, introduced him to key contacts across the military. Rodriguez had been one of her first recruits, the Marine who had lost most of his hearing, but had developed an uncanny ability to read electronic signatures. He was ready for command, had learned everything she could teach him, and added his own innovations. On her last day with the squadron, Sarah gathered all her pilots in the hangar. They stood around one of the Ghost Hawks, the aircraft that had changed all their lives, that had given them a second chance when conventional forces had written them off. "I'm proud of what we've built here," Sarah said, looking at each pilot in turn. "Not just the operational successes, not just the missions we've flown, but the culture we've created. A culture that says there are many ways to be a warrior, many paths to excellence, many ways to serve." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Each of you came to the Ghost Hawk program carrying doubts. Doubts about whether you were still capable, whether you still had value, whether you could still serve. And each of you has proven those doubts wrong, not by overcoming your limitations, but by finding ways to turn them into strengths." Lieutenant Reed spoke up. "You showed us that, ma'am. You were the first. You proved it was possible." Sarah shook her head. "I didn't prove anything alone. We proved it together. Every one of you contributed to building this program, to refining our tactics, to demonstrating that the Ghost Hawk philosophy works, and you'll continue to prove it long after I'm gone." She turned to Rodriguez. "Major, the squadron is in excellent hands. Take care of these pilots. Keep pushing the envelope. Keep proving that different doesn't mean less." Rodriguez saluted. "We will, ma'am. Thank you for everything you've taught us." The farewell was bittersweet. Sarah had poured herself into building this squadron, had found her purpose and her place here. Leaving was difficult, even though she knew she was moving toward something equally important. As she walked out of the hangar for the last time as the squadron commander, Chen was waiting by the door. "You're really doing this," he said, "leaving to help the Air Force." "I am, but I'll be back to visit, and I'll stay involved, make sure both programs develop in compatible directions." Chen smiled. "The Ghost Hawk wouldn't exist without you, Sarah. Not as a program anyway. Maybe as a technology, but not as a philosophy, not as a way of thinking about warfare. You took an experimental aircraft and turned it into something that's changing how the military operates." "We did that together," Sarah corrected. "You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. You showed me what was possible. And now you're going to do the same for a whole new group of pilots," Chen said. "The Air Force doesn't know how lucky they are." Sarah, now Colonel Mitchell, soon to be promoted to Brigadier General, stood on the flight line at Nellis Air Force Base, watching as 20 Air Force Ghost Hawks prepared for a major exercise. She had spent 3 years helping the Air Force develop their program, establishing training protocols, selecting pilots, refining tactics. The Air Force Ghost Hawks were slightly different from their Navy counterparts, optimized for different mission profiles, adapted to Air Force operational doctrine, but the underlying philosophy was the same: deception over destruction, information over firepower, strategic thinking over pure reaction. The pilots she had trained in the Air Force were just as diverse as those she had recruited for the Navy: veterans dealing with PTSD, pilots with medical conditions that precluded high-performance flying, officers who had been told they didn't fit the traditional fighter pilot mold. All of them had found a home in the Ghost Hawk program, a place where their unique experiences and adaptations were valued rather than seen as deficiencies. Major Elena Vasquez walked over to join Sarah. Vasquez had been one of the first Air Force pilots Sarah recruited, a former F-16 pilot who had developed severe migraines after a crash. She now commanded the Air Force's Ghost Hawk squadron and had proven to be an exceptional leader. "Ready for the exercise, ma'am?" Vasquez asked. "Always," Sarah replied. "What's the scenario?" "Penetration of integrated air defense network, supporting a deep strike package targeting simulated enemy command and control facilities. We'll be operating in conjunction with Navy Ghost Hawks, your old squadron actually. Major Rodriguez is leading their element." Sarah felt a surge of pride. This was what she had been working toward: Ghost Hawks from different services operating together, supporting conventional forces, demonstrating how information dominance could transform modern warfare. The exercise was a complete success. The Ghost Hawks from both services coordinated seamlessly, creating a web of deceptions that rendered the enemy's sophisticated air defense network useless. Conventional strike aircraft penetrated deep into defended territory without encountering opposition, because the defenders were too busy chasing phantoms and responding to false threats to realize where the real attack was coming from. During the debrief, the exercise commander, an Air Force general who had initially been skeptical of the Ghost Hawk program, shook his head in amazement. "I've been flying and commanding air operations for 30 years. I've never seen anything like this. You didn't defeat the enemy. You made them defeat themselves. They had all the tools they needed to defend against the strike, but they couldn't use them effectively because they couldn't trust their own information. Sarah smiled. That's the Ghost Hawk advantage, sir. We win by controlling the narrative, by determining what the enemy sees and believes, by making them respond to a battlefield that exists only in their sensors. That evening, Sarah received a call from Admiral Hawthorne. Congratulations are in order, Colonel. Your promotion to Brigadier General was approved today. You'll be the youngest general officer in the Air Force. Thank you, sir. I'm honored. You've earned it. More importantly, you've built something that will outlast us both. The Ghost Hawk program, both the Navy and Air Force versions, represents a fundamental shift in military thinking. And that shift started with you, with your willingness to embrace a different path, to turn your limitations into strengths. After the call, Sarah sat quietly, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. 5 years ago, she had been sitting in Commander Webb's office, being told she was being reassigned to evaluate obsolete aircraft. She had felt like her career was over, like everything she had worked for had been taken away by an injury she couldn't control. But that assignment had led her to the Ghost Hawk, to a mission that was perfectly suited to her changed capabilities, to a role where she could make a difference in ways she had never imagined. She had built 2 squadrons, trained dozens of pilots, helped establish a new approach to aerial warfare that was being adopted across the military. And through it all, she had learned the most important lesson, that worth isn't determined by how well you fit someone else's definition of excellence, but by how effectively you serve using your own unique combination of skills and experiences. Sarah pulled out her phone and looked at the photograph she had taken from her quarters years ago, herself and her father at her commissioning ceremony. She had carried it with her through every move, every assignment, every challenge. "I found my place, Dad," she whispered just as she had years ago, "and I've helped others find theirs. I think you'd be proud of that." Her phone buzzed with a message from David, now her fiancé. "Dinner to celebrate the promotion? I'm making your favorite." Sarah smiled and replied, "On my way, and we should talk about the wedding. I think it's time to set a date." As she drove toward David's place, Sarah thought about the Ghost Hawks, both the aircraft and the pilots who flew them. They would continue their work in the shadows, winning victories that would never be publicly acknowledged, protecting people who would never know they existed, and that was exactly how it should be. The Ghost Hawks didn't need recognition or glory. They needed only to know that they were making a difference, that their unique skills and experiences were valued, that they belonged. Sarah had found her place not by conforming to expectations, but by embracing what made her different. She had turned her injury from a career-ending setback into the qualification for a mission no one else could have filled as well. The Ghost Hawk had taught her that appearances deceive, that true power often hides in plain sight, that the most dangerous warriors are the ones nobody sees coming, and she had spent the last 5 years teaching that lesson to others, building a community of pilots who understood that there are many ways to serve, many paths to excellence, many ways to be a warrior. As she pulled into David's driveway, Sarah felt at peace. She had built a career that mattered, had found love and connection, had helped others find their own paths. The TBI that had once seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of something new, something better, something more aligned with who she really was. She thought about all the pilots she had trained, all the missions they had flown, all the lives they had saved through their work in the shadows. Each one had been told they weren't good enough, weren't capable enough, weren't the right fit for combat aviation. And each one had proven those judgments wrong, not by overcoming their limitations, but by finding missions where those limitations didn't matter, where their unique adaptations were actually advantages. Sarah walked toward the door, ready to celebrate her promotion, ready to plan her wedding, ready to continue building the legacy she had started in that decrepit-looking aircraft that nobody took seriously until it was too late. The Ghost Hawk had given her a second chance, and she had spent that chance giving others the same opportunity, creating a place where different meant valuable, where adaptation meant strength, where being underestimated was the greatest advantage of all. It wasn't the career she had planned. It was better. It was everything.